I came to return my father's
I
debt
came to
note.
return my
Annie
father's
spoke,
debt
then
note.
reached into the pocket of her old blue jacket and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper that had been folded many times. Richard Whitmore looked at the paper, but he did not reach for it. His gray eyes moved from the paper to Annie's face. "A debt note?" he asked, his voice cold. "What debt?" Annie swallowed hard. "This is between you and my father." Richard let out a short breath through his nose. It was not quite a laugh, but it was enough to make the sound insulting. "Your father?" "Yes, sir." "Then who is your father?" Annie lifted the paper a little higher. "Samuel Carter. Don't you remember him?" For 1 second, Richard's face showed nothing at all. Then he slowly shook his head, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Do you have any idea how many men in this country are named Samuel Carter?" Richard said. "Are you all right? You come all the way to my gate, hold up an old piece of paper, ask me if I remember your father, and expect what? That I'll collapse with emotion right here?" Annie's arm did not lower. Richard glanced over her shoulder toward the long road in front of the mansion, then looked back at her. "Who told you to do this?" "No one." "Then who are you trying to fool?" Annie's jaw tightened. "I'm not fooling anyone. Young lady, every month someone comes to this house with a story. A sick mother, a dead uncle, a failed investment, old promises no one can prove anymore. Now you show up with a name and a piece of paper, and you expect me to believe I owe your family something? You signed it." Richard's eyes narrowed. Annie carefully unfolded the paper. The crease down the middle had grown so weak that she was afraid it would tear if she moved too quickly. She turned the paper toward him so he could see the writing inside. "I, Richard Whitmore, owe Samuel Carter $42,000. And far more than that." Her voice held until the end, though the final words almost caught in her throat. Richard's eyes stopped on the signature, but he still did not take the paper. "That could easily be copied." "It wasn't. And I'm supposed to accept that because you say so?" "No. I hoped you would remember the man who helped you survive when you had nothing." Richard's face hardened. Before he could answer, footsteps sounded from the entrance of the mansion. A young man, about 25, came down the front steps. He wore a navy sweater and dress pants, his hair still slightly damp as if he had just come from inside. He looked at Annie, then at his father, and then at the paper in her hand. "Dad?" he asked. "What's going on?" Richard did not turn around. "Go back inside, Evan." But Evan kept walking closer. "Is everything all right?" "It's nothing." Evan glanced at Annie. His look was not exactly rude, but it was full of confusion. "What is that paper?" Annie answered before Richard could speak. "A debt note." Evan gave a small, uncertain smile, as if he thought he had misheard her. "A debt note?" Richard's voice sharpened. "Evan," but his son kept staring at him. "What debt, Dad? Do we owe someone money? Or did she come here asking for money?" Annie lowered the paper just enough to look Evan directly in the eyes. "I didn't come here to ask for anything. I came to return something my father kept for too long." Evan frowned. "Who was your father?" "Samuel Carter." The name caused no reaction on Evan's face. Richard stepped forward half a pace, putting himself between his son and Annie. "That's enough," he said. "You, Annie Carter." "Miss Carter," Richard said, shaking his head again, this time with clearer contempt. "I don't know you. I don't know your father, and I certainly do not handle money matters at my front gate because a young woman suddenly appears with a wrinkled piece of paper and claims she came to return my debt note. This is not just a wrinkled piece of paper. To me, that is exactly what it is." Annie's fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. "Your name is on it. Anyone can write a name. Your signature is on it. Signatures can be copied, and my father's signature is on it too," Annie said, her voice rising before she could stop it. "Samuel Carter. Right there. His name. His signature. The hand that fixed machines until the knuckles were swollen. The hand that kept this paper when he had every reason to burn it." Richard's eyes flicked down to the paper, then quickly moved away. Annie held it closer. "Look at it. I've seen enough." "No, you haven't. Do not raise your voice at me on my property. Then don't pretend I picked your name out of a phone book." Richard's face flushed slightly. "This is absurd. I have nothing to do with that paper. Nothing. If there was a real debt, a real legal agreement, there would be clear records, bank documents, legal filings, contracts, not a yellowed piece of paper brought here by a girl I have never met." "A girl," Annie repeated, and the word came out bitterly. Richard continued, his voice cold and blunt. You think I, Richard Whitmore, owe money because you show up with a folded paper and a story about a dead man? That is not evidence. That is a performance. Evan was beginning to look uneasy. Dad, maybe we should… No, Richard cut in. We should not do anything. Annie looked at Evan for a moment, then turned back to Richard. He wrote about you. Richard's expression changed. Only slightly, but Annie saw it, and that small change gave her courage. In his journal, she said. He wrote your name more than once. Richard's jaw tightened. A journal is not a legal document. No, Annie replied. It hurts more than that. Evan's voice grew quieter. Dad, did you know someone named Samuel Carter? Richard answered too quickly. When I was young, I knew many people. But did you know him? This time, Richard did not answer right away. Annie reached into her jacket again, touching the edge of the old photograph hidden inside, but she did not take it out yet. My father died 3 weeks ago, she said. He died in a rented house. Medical bills were piled on the kitchen table. The landlord was waiting to clear out his things. When I was sorting through his old tools, I found this under the basement stairs. The letter, the journal, the things he never told me because he thought silence was less bitter. Richard's voice dropped. Careful, Miss Carter. My father was careful his whole life, Annie said. He kept your secret. He kept your signature. He kept your reputation clean while his own life fell apart. Evan looked back and forth between them. The confusion on his face slowly began to fade. Dad, is this true? Richard turned to him. Go inside. No, Evan said quietly. Not yet. Then Evan looked back at Annie. Whatever doubt had been on his face hardened into the familiar pride of the Whitmore family. Listen, Evan said, his voice calm but sharp enough to wound. My father says he doesn't know you. He says he doesn't know your father. That is enough. Annie looked at him. It isn't enough. It is, Evan said. You cannot just come to someone's home with a few old papers and start accusing them at the gate. I didn't just come here. You know what I mean. No, Annie said. I know exactly what you mean. Evan's face tightened. No one here owes your family anything. Those words struck Annie harder than Richard's denial. She slowly folded the paper along its old creases and slipped it back inside her jacket. Richard watched the movement, but said nothing. Evan continued, his voice lower now, but no gentler. Whatever trouble you're in, this is not how you fix it. Don't come here making a scene. Don't try to turn my father's name into a chance to get money. Annie's hand froze on the pocket of her jacket. Evan looked away for half a second, then looked back at her. You know how this looks. Yes, Annie said. I know exactly how people like you think this looks. Richard spoke. Evan, that's enough. Annie looked at Richard. You taught your son well. Richard's expression changed, but he did not answer. Annie stepped back from the open gate. I came here to return the debt note. You refused to take it, so I'll keep it a little longer. Evan forced out a sigh. Maybe that's for the best. No, Annie said. Maybe it's worse. Evan frowned. Annie touched the journal hidden beneath her jacket. Because next time, I won't be bringing only a piece of paper. Richard's eyes immediately dropped to her coat. Annie saw it, and she knew the journal had reached him, even though she had not shown it yet. She turned and started toward the road. The gardener stood near the hedge, still holding his pruning shears. The guard in the gatehouse gripped his radio tightly but said nothing. Behind Annie, Evan said, Don't come back here. Annie stopped, but she did not turn around. My father spent half his life not coming back, she said. It didn't save him, and it won't save your father either. No one answered. Annie walked down the long drive toward the main road. The debt note pressed against her chest, the journal heavy beneath her jacket. The mansion still stood behind her, bright and quiet, but in Annie's eyes, it no longer looked untouched. She had brought Samuel Carter's name to the Whitmore gate, and Richard Whitmore had refused the debt note. Annie had just rounded the curve of the driveway when she heard footsteps behind her. Wait. She kept walking. The road beyond the gate looked much farther away than it had when she arrived, and the jacket on her shoulders seemed to grow heavier with every step. Miss Carter, the voice called again. Please. This time Annie stopped, but she did not turn around right away. She knew it was Evan before she saw him. Richard Whitmore would never chase after someone in front of his own gate. Evan came up behind her, breathing harder than he wanted to show. Annie turned to face him. Did your father send you? No. Evan glanced back toward the open gate, where Richard was still standing near the walkway. He doesn't know I followed you. Then you should go back before he remembers you're allowed to think for yourself. Evan flinched at the words, but he did not leave. I shouldn't have said what I said. Which part? He looked uncomfortable. The part about no one owing your family anything. That was the main part. I know. Evan rubbed the back of his neck. I've heard a lot of stories. People come to my father with all kinds of things. Some of them are true. A lot of them aren't. You thought I was one of them? I thought I was protecting him. Annie let out a short, dry laugh. From a girl holding a piece of paper? From whatever that paper might lead to. Evan looked at her jacket, then at the pocket where she had tucked the debt note away. Can I see it again? No, I'm asking. I'm not taking. That's fairly new for your family. His face tightened, but he accepted it. Fair. Annie studied him for a moment. What do you want to know? Evan lowered his voice. What did you mean when you said your father kept it? Annie looked toward the road ahead. A car passed slowly, its tires hissing against the damp pavement. My father's name was Samuel Carter. He was a mechanic, not the kind who just changed oil. He could listen to an engine for 10 seconds and tell which part was about to fail. He worked with your father before Whitmore became the name it is now. My father built the company himself. That's what he told you. Everyone says that. Maybe everyone in your house. Evan's mouth opened, then closed again. You said there was a journal. There is. And the debt note? Annie hesitated. Then she reached into her jacket and took out the folded paper. But she did not hand it to him. She only opened it and held it between them. Evan stepped closer, careful not to touch it. His eyes moved across the old lines. $42,000, he read quietly. And more than money can name. That line is the part my father never explained, Annie said, because he never explained any of this. Is that really my father's signature? You tell me. Evan looked at it longer than Richard had allowed himself to. It looks like his old signature. Old signature? After he became more public, he changed it. Shorter, cleaner. But this... Evan stopped. This what? This is how he signed when he was in college. I've seen it on a few framed things in his office. Annie folded the paper before the wind could catch it. Then maybe your father should have looked a little closer. Evan swallowed. Do you have anything else? Annie touched the photograph inside her pocket. She remembered Richard's face when she mentioned the journal. She remembered Evan saying no one owed her family anything. She remembered the words her father had written under the basement stairs, words buried in the dark while the man who owed him lived behind iron gates and stone walls. Slowly, she took out the photograph. Evan accepted it only after she nodded. For several seconds, he said nothing. His thumb hovered near the edge of the faded photograph, careful not to cover either face. The two young men in the picture looked as if they had been caught in an ordinary living moment. Samuel Carter was smiling brightly. His sleeves rolled up, his arms smeared with grease. Richard Whitmore stood beside him, younger and thinner, one arm around Samuel's shoulders as if friendship were something that could hold up the whole world. Above them, the sign was clear, Carter and Whitmore Repair Company. Evan's face changed. That's my father, he said. Yes. And that's yours? Samuel Carter. Evan looked up. Why is his name first? If this moment touched your heart, please like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your support helps this channel share more stories about truth, family, and justice. And if you believe the past should never be buried when someone's life was broken, please subscribe to the channel. Something inside Annie went still. It was not the question she had expected. And because it came from Evan, it carried more weight than if she had asked it herself. I don't know, she said. But I think your father does. Evan turned toward the mansion. He told me he opened the first shop by himself. My father's journal says otherwise. Can I show him this picture? Annie reached for it at once. No. Please. You told me not to come back a minute ago. I was wrong. That was quick. I'm trying to fix it. This can't be fixed by hanging a picture in the entryway. No, Evan said. But I can make him look at something he can't pretend he didn't hear because of a gate. Annie looked him straight in the eyes. If I give you that picture and it disappears, I lose one of the last pieces I have of my father. I won't let that happen. You're his son. I know. Evan's voice dropped. That's why I need to know whether he lied to me. Annie took the photograph back, looked at it one more time, and pressed it against her chest. I'll keep it. Evan nodded immediately. All right. No guard touches me. No lawyer takes my bag. No one says I'm making a scene. I'll handle it. 5 minutes ago, you couldn't even stand up to your father. That was before I saw his face in that picture. Annie nearly refused. Everything in her told her not to return to a place where she had just been told she did not belong. But her father had kept that picture for a reason. A name could be denied. A signature could be called fake. A debt note could be dismissed as an old scrap of paper. But a photograph made denial harder. All right, she said, but I keep it. Evan turned and started up the driveway faster than Annie expected. Then he looked back. Come on, I'm coming. He reached out as if to take her wrist. Not roughly, only urgently. But almost immediately, he seemed to remember himself and let go. Sorry. Annie did not answer. She walked beside him, not behind him. At the gate, the guard straightened. Mr. Whitmore said she was to leave. Evan did not slow down. She's with me. Sir, I said she's with me. The guard stepped aside. Richard was no longer standing at the gate. He had moved closer to the front steps, speaking with Victor Sloan. The moment Victor saw Annie return, his face tightened. Richard turned as well, irritation clear on his mouth. Evan, Richard said, what are you doing? Evan did not stop until he was only a few steps from his father. Annie stood beside him, holding the photograph in both hands. You need to see this, Evan said. Richard's eyes moved from his son to Annie. I already told Miss Carter. No, Evan interrupted. The word came out stronger than either of them expected. Not the paper. This. Annie lifted the photograph. At first, Richard's face hardened, as if he meant to deny it before he had even looked. But then his eyes found the image. The color slowly drained from his face. Victor stepped closer. Mr. Whitmore, I advise against continuing this conversation. Richard did not seem to hear him. Evan pointed to the sign above the two young men in the photograph. Carter and Whitmore. Dad, why does it say Carter and Whitmore? Richard's throat moved. Where did you get that? Annie answered. From my father's tin box. Richard stared at the photograph as if it had traveled through decades just to stand at his front door and accuse him. Evan's voice grew quieter. You told me there was no one named Carter. I never said that. You told me you started alone. Richard looked at his son. It was more complicated than that. Annie almost laughed, but there would have been nothing pleasant in it. Complicated, she said. That's what rich people call the truth after they've polished it for too many years. Victor Coutin. This conversation should either move inside or end right here. Annie held the photograph tighter. Inside is fine. Richard's eyes returned to her. You do not decide what happens in my house. No, Annie said. But my father helped build the first place that carried your name. So maybe you can spare one room long enough to explain why his disappeared. Evan looked at Richard, waiting. The open gate stood behind Annie. The mansion rose behind Richard. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice lower than before. Come inside. Victor snapped his head toward him. Richard. Richard did not look at him. Not now. Annie did not move right away. Evan glanced at her. Are you all right? No, she said, slipping the photograph back into her jacket before anyone could reach for it. But I'll come in. She followed them up the driveway, past the perfectly trimmed hedges, past the expensive cars, toward the front steps of the mansion, where her father's name had never been spoken. The debt note was still in her pocket. The journal was still heavy beneath her coat. The front doors opened before Richard touched them. A housekeeper in a gray dress stepped aside, and Annie walked into air that smelled faintly of lemon oil, cut flowers, and old money. The foyer rose 2 stories above her, with a chandelier hanging over a polished floor so clean she could see the shape of her shoes in it. She thought of the basement stairs at home, damp wood under her feet, dust on her sleeves. Her father's old tools boxed up beside the furnace. The difference between the two places was not just money. It was what money was allowed to erase. Victor Sloan followed close behind. Richard, this is unwise. Richard kept walking. I said not now. That does not make this less reckless. Evan turned on him. She showed us a photograph, Victor. A photograph is not a claim. It's a question, Evan said. And nobody in this house seems eager to answer it. Richard stopped at the entrance to a large sitting room. He looked older than he had at the gate. Not weak, only less polished around the edges. "Everyone inside," he said. Annie did not move until Evan stepped in first. She had learned not to enter rich rooms too quickly. People watched how you walked, what you touched, where your eyes went. They made decisions before you spoke. So she kept her hands near her coat, kept her bag close, and crossed the threshold with the same quiet care her father used when handling a machine that might still have power running through it. The sitting room was wide, lined with books and framed photographs. Richard with senators. Richard at a hospital ribbon cutting. Richard beside a university president. Richard handing a large check to a smiling charity board. In every image he looked generous, steady, certain. Annie wondered how many photographs it took to cover one old picture of him standing beside Samuel Carter under a hand-painted shop sign. Richard pointed toward a chair. "Sit. I'll stand. This will be easier if you sit. It was easy for you when I stood outside." Evan made a small sound, not quite approval, not quite discomfort. Victor's mouth tightened. Richard looked at Annie for a moment, then lowered himself into a chair near the fireplace. Evan sat on the arm of the sofa, restless. Victor remained by the door, already preparing to turn whatever happened into language no ordinary person could fight. Richard held out his hand. "The photograph." Annie shook her head. "I'll hold it. You came here to show it to me. And I did. I need to examine it. No, you need to answer why my father's name was on that sign." Richard's fingers curled once, then relaxed. Carter and Whitmore was never a corporation. It was a small repair operation, a rented bay, a few tools, a name painted on wood. Annie's voice stayed low. "So it existed." Richard looked toward the fireplace. For a short time, Evan rubbed his palms together. "Dad, why have I never heard of it?" "Because it was nothing." Annie pulled the photograph from her coat and held it up. It was not nothing to the man who kept this wrapped in cloth for more than 20 years. Richard looked at the picture again, and this time memory came before pride could stop it. His eyes moved over the sign. The open garage door behind the two men. The oil drum in the corner. Samuel's grin. Annie saw his lips part, then close. Victor stepped in. "Miss Carter, assuming for a moment that your father and Mr. Whitmore knew each other, that does not establish a debt." Annie turned toward him. "You always talk like you're putting a lid on a coffin." Evan looked down quickly, fighting a reaction. Victor's voice sharpened. "I speak precisely." "No," Annie said. "You speak safely. There's a difference." Richard raised his hand. "Enough." Annie reached into her coat and took out the debt note again. She placed it on the low table between them, not too close to Richard. "There. The picture answers whether he knew my father. The note answers whether he owed him." Richard did not reach for it. "You still have not explained how you found it." "I told you. In my father's tin box." "Then tell it clearly." Annie breathed in slowly. The room seemed to tighten around her. She had not planned to give them the basement. That place was hers and her father's, poor and private. But Richard had made a life out of half-told history. She would not answer him with another one. "My father died 3 weeks ago," she said. "After the funeral, the landlord gave me 70. 2 hours to clear the house. Rent was behind. Medical bills took what was left. I went down to the basement because most of Daddy's old things were there. Work shirts, tools, coffee cans full of screws, machine sketches, boxes he never let me throw out." Evan listened without moving. "There was a tin box under the stairs," Annie continued. "Rust on the lid, wrapped in one of his old flannel shirts. On top he wrote, 'For Annie, when the house gets quiet.'" Richard's gaze dropped. Annie saw that line reach him. "I opened it sitting on the concrete floor," she said. Inside was the debt note, the photograph, a fountain pen, a broken pocket watch, and his diary. At the word diary, Victor shifted. Richard did not. Evan said, "You brought it?" "Yes. Can we see it?" Victor answered before Annie could. "Absolutely not." Annie looked at him. "You afraid of paper too?" "I am concerned about forged documents, emotional manipulation, and potential extortion." "Extortion?" Annie repeated. "I didn't ask for money. You came with a debt note. I came to return it. Victor gave a thin smile. A convenient distinction. Annie felt her anger rise, but she kept her voice quiet. My father taught me that when a man uses big words to make a simple wrong sound complicated, he already knows what he did. Richard looked up at that. Samuel said that? He asked. Annie turned back to him. More than once. For a moment, Richard was not at the mansion. Annie could almost see him somewhere else. Younger. Standing in a repair shop with the smell of hot metal and coffee around him. Then he shut the memory away. Your father had opinions, Richard said. He had more than that. He had receipts. Victor stiffened. Annie opened her bag and took out the diary. She did not hand it over. She opened it to the first marked page and held it in both hands. My father wrote that you came to him hungry, proud, and half broken, she said. He wrote that he gave you a place to sleep when you lost your room over on Pratt Street. He wrote that he helped you rent the first bay. He wrote that the compressor in that shop failed during your first big order, and he stayed awake 2 nights to rebuild it while you went out begging for more time. Richard's face lost some of its color. Evan turned to him. Is that true? Richard's answer came rougher than before. I had help when I was young. Everyone has help. Not everyone erases the helper, Annie said. Victor moved closer. Mr. Whitmore, do not respond to that. Richard's eyes stayed on Annie. What else did he write? Annie turned a page. That you had hunger. He had patience. Between the two of you, he thought you could build something honest. The room went quiet except for the faint hum of heat through the vents. Evan said softly, honest? Annie did not look away from Richard. That word came up a lot before the debt did. Richard's hands rested on his knees now. He was trying to appear calm, but one thumb moved against the seam of his trousers. Annie noticed. So did Evan. Victor said, this is going nowhere. No, Evan said. It's going somewhere you don't like. Victor looked at him. Mr. Whitmore's interests. He's my father, Evan said. Not your client in front of me. That stopped Victor for half a breath. Richard stood. Evan. No, Dad. If this is nonsense, say it. Say the shop never existed. Say, that's not your old signature. Say, Samuel Carter didn't help you. Richard's face tightened. You are asking questions about years you do not understand. Then help me understand them. Annie closed the diary slowly. She could feel the house pressing around them, the portraits, the polished table, the measured voices. But something had changed. At the gate, Richard's denial had stood alone. In this room, it had to stand beside a photograph, a note, a diary, and his son's questions. Richard looked at Annie. What do you want? The question sounded simple, but it carried all the suspicion he had not spoken. Money. Apology. Threat. Settlement. Silence. Annie put the diary back in her bag. I want to know why my father died with your name locked in a tin box while your name is carved into half the city. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. I want to know why he paid $42,000 for you, she said, and why, after you became everything he once believed you could be, you left him with nothing but paper. Victor said, that is an accusation. Yes, Annie said, it is. Evan's voice came quiet. 42,000 for what? Richard turned away. There it was. Not an answer. Worse than an answer. Annie picked up the debt note from the table and slid it back into her coat. You don't have to tell me today. Richard turned back. Then why are you still here? Because now I know you remember enough to be afraid of the rest. Victor reached for the door. This meeting is over. Annie nodded. For today. Evan stood. Annie, wait. She paused at the doorway. He looked embarrassed, angry, and shaken all at once. Can I call you? If I have questions? Victor said, no. Annie looked at Richard instead. Ask your father first. If he tells you the truth, you won't need me. If he doesn't, you'll know where to start. Where? She thought of the basement, the notice on the door, Mrs. Evelyn's kitchen, the old name she had not yet followed. Find out who Leonard Price is, she said. Richard's head turned sharply. Annie caught it. So did Evan. Thank you, Annie said, though it was not gratitude. It was confirmation. She left the sitting room with her bag against her side and her father's proof still close. Behind her, no one spoke until she reached the foyer. Then Evan's voice rose, no longer careful. "Dad, who is Leonard Price?" Annie did not hear Richard's answer. She did not need to. The silence that followed her out of the mansion was answer enough. Annie did not look back until she reached the bottom of the front steps. The doors closed behind her with a soft weight that made the mansion seem sealed again. But she knew better now. A closed door was not the same as a clean secret. Marcus Hill stood near the rose beds with a pair of gloves tucked under one arm. He had gone back to work, or had pretended to, but his eyes moved toward Annie as she came down the steps. "You all right, Miss Carter?" he asked. Annie stopped beside the walk. The question was simple, and because it was simple, it nearly undid her. Inside that house, every sentence had been a trap or a defense. Marcus asked like a man who expected an honest answer and could bear hearing it. "No," she said, "but I'm leaving with more than I came in with." He gave a small nod. "Sometimes that's enough for one morning." She looked toward the long drive. "You knew my father's name." "I knew of it." Marcus glanced back at the mansion. "Old Mr. Whitmore had a driver before my time. Mr. Ellis. Used to sit with me during lunch and talk about the early days. Said there was a man named Sam who could fix anything but a greedy heart." Annie felt the words settle deep. "He said that?" "More than once. I didn't know it meant anything to me until you said the name at the gate." "Do you know Leonard Price?" Marcus took a breath through his nose, thinking. "Watch repairman. Harford Road, if he's still there." Mr. Ellis had an old pocket watch Leonard kept alive for 30 years. Annie nodded. "Thank you. Miss Carter." She paused. "Men in big houses count on folks getting tired before the truth does." Marcus pulled on one glove, then the other. "Don't get tired too soon." Annie carried that with her down the drive. The gate opened without anyone speaking. The guard did not meet her eyes this time, and that was fine. She had not come for his respect. At the road, the air felt colder, but her steps were steadier. The bus took longer to come than before. By the time she reached her neighborhood, the gray morning had turned into a flat afternoon. The row houses leaned close to one another, tired but familiar. A man worked under the hood of an old Buick near the corner. Two women stood outside the laundromat with baskets on their hips. The smell of fried onions drifted from the carry-out place next to the beauty supply store. Annie had grown up thinking this block was small because everything in it was worn down. Now, after Whitmore Estate, she saw something else. People here remembered. They remembered who fixed their furnace in January, who brought soup when somebody died, who lent a ladder, who sat on a porch when bad news came. Rich people had files. Poor people had witnesses. Mrs. Evelyn was waiting on her front steps. "Well," she said. Annie climbed the steps and sat beside her without being invited. Her legs were tired now that no one important was watching. "He remembers," Annie said. Evelyn looked straight ahead. "I figured. He won't say it." "That too." His son saw the picture. "He made his father let me inside." Evelyn turned. "The boy did?" "After accusing me of trying to get money out of them." "Both things can be true. A person can start wrong and still take one step right." Annie pulled the diary closer against her side. "Richard reacted when I said Leonard Price." Evelyn's face changed in a quiet way. "Then Leonard knows plenty. You said his shop is on Harford Road? If he hasn't moved on to Glory or Florida." Despite herself, Annie almost smiled. Which one would be worse? For Leonard? Florida. Man hates humidity and strangers in shorts. They went into Evelyn's kitchen because Annie's house was half-boxed and too cold for sitting. Evelyn put a skillet on the stove and warmed cornbread and butter, then poured coffee into two mismatched mugs. Annie's mug had a faded picture of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. Her father had once fixed Evelyn's sink and refused payment. Evelyn had brought him coffee in that same mug, insisting a working man deserved something hot even when he was too stubborn to charge. Annie wrapped both hands around it. "Tell me exactly what happened," Evelyn said. So Annie did. She told her about the gate, Evan, the photograph, the sitting room, Victor Sloane's careful insults, Richard's face when she said Leonard's name. She told it in order because the order mattered. Men like Victor would break a truth into pieces and argue each one looked too small to matter. Annie wanted to keep the whole thing intact. When she finished, Evelyn sat quietly for a long moment. "That lawyer," Evelyn said at last, "he'll come at you. He already did. No. Today he sized you up. Next, he'll look for where you're soft. Annie looked toward the window, across the narrow yard to her own back door. The house, the hospital bills, your age, your father's pride. Anything he can press until you sound angry enough for people to stop listening. I am angry. You have a right to be, but don't hand him your anger raw. Cook it first. Annie looked at her. Evelyn took a bite of cornbread. Your grandmother used to say that. Raw anger burns your own hand. Cooked anger feeds a case. Annie breathed out. I don't have a case. I have a diary, a note, and a picture. And maybe Leonard Price. Maybe. Evelyn stood and took an old address book from a kitchen drawer. It was thick with loose papers, church programs, funeral cards, and receipts tucked between pages. She flipped through the P section with a wet fingertip. Price, Leonard, she murmured. Here he is. She read out an address on Harford Road and a phone number written in blue ink that had faded at the edges. Annie entered it into her phone, then called. The line rang 6 times. A man answered with a voice rough from age or cigarettes. Price Time Repair. Annie straightened. Mr. Leonard Price? Depends who's asking and whether they're trying to sell me a warranty. My name is Annie Carter. Samuel Carter was my father. The line went quiet. Evelyn watched Annie from across the table. After a moment, Leonard said, Samuel's gone then. Yes, sir. 3 weeks ago. A long breath moved through the phone. I'm sorry to hear that. Your father was one of the few men I trusted with a machine I cared about, and a truth I didn't. Annie closed her eyes for half a second. There it was again. Proof that her father had existed beyond sickness, beyond unpaid rent, beyond the version of him the world had left her. I found a debt note, she said, between him and Richard Whitmore. Leonard did not ask which Richard. He did not ask what note. Instead, he said, You went to the house, didn't you? Yes. He denied it? Yes. Leonard gave a tired sound. Of course he did. Denial is cheaper than restitution. Annie gripped the phone. Do you know what the $42,000 was for? I know enough to tell you not over the phone. Can I come see you? Tomorrow morning. 9. Bring the note. The diary if you have it. And that picture of the shop. You know about the picture? I was standing across the street when it was taken. Annie looked at Evelyn. Her heart kicked once. Hard. Leonard continued. And, Miss Carter? Yes, sir? If Richard Whitmore knows you found me, he may send someone before you get here. Don't give your originals to anybody. Not a lawyer. Not a clerk. Not a man with soft hands and clean shoes. I won't. Good. Your father paid dearly for those papers. Don't make him pay twice. The line clicked off. Annie lowered the phone slowly. Evelyn leaned forward. Well, he was there, Annie said. When the picture was taken, Evelyn nodded once, as if something old had just been confirmed in her bones. Then tomorrow we go early. I can go alone. I'm sure you can, but you won't. Annie did not argue. The kitchen smelled of coffee and buttered cornbread. Outside, a siren passed several blocks away, then faded. Across the yard, the yellow notice still hung on Annie's door, and the boxes inside still waited. Nothing had been fixed. The rent was still unpaid. Her father was still gone. Richard Whitmore was still rich. But tomorrow had a shape now. It had a street, a time, and an old man who remembered the hour her father's future changed hands. That night, Annie went back to her own house and packed the tin box herself. She wrapped the diary in her father's flannel shirt, slid the debt note between 2 pieces of cardboard, and placed the photograph in an envelope. Before closing the lid, she held the broken pocket watch in her palm. Its hands had stopped at 2:17. She did not know why her father had kept it, or when it had quit working. Maybe Leonard would know. Maybe all broken things kept the time of what broke them. Annie set the watch back in the box and closed the lid. For the first time since the landlord's notice, she did not feel like she was only clearing out the dead. She was carrying him forward. Morning came with rain tapping the kitchen window and the smell of old cardboard in the front room. Annie had slept 3 hours on the couch with her coat over her shoulders and the tin box on the floor beside her. When she woke, her first thought was not of Richard Whitmore or the mansion. It was of the notice on the door and the sound her father used to make clearing his throat before he tried to pretend the day would be easier than it was. Mrs. Evelyn knocked at 8:15, carrying an umbrella, a purse large enough to hold groceries, and the look of a woman who had already decided nobody was going to talk her out of anything. "You eat?" she asked as soon as Annie opened the door. "I had coffee." "That's not food." "That's a warning." "I'm fine. Young people have been saying that since Moses, and it still ain't true." Annie almost smiled. Evelyn stepped inside, looked at the boxes stacked along the wall, then at the tin box on the table. Her voice softened. "You got everything? The note, the diary, the picture, the watch. Keep them close. If anybody asks to hold them, you say no unless Leonard says otherwise." "I know. I'm saying it anyway. The world has a habit of taking from girls who were raised to be polite." Annie looked down at her father's old flannel wrapped around the diary. "Daddy raised me to be respectful. Respectful is fine. Available is not." They took the bus because Annie had sold her father's old sedan 2 months before he died to cover a prescription insurance would not fully pay for. Evelyn said nothing about the bus fare when she dropped coins into the box for both of them. Annie noticed anyway, and promised herself she would pay her back. Evelyn would refuse. Annie would find a way. Harford Road looked half awake when they arrived. Storefronts stood close together, some open, some still dark. A barber shop had a red, white, and blue pole that no longer spun. A diner window advertised eggs, toast, and coffee for $6. Outside a small grocery, an older man hosed down the sidewalk while a woman in a raincoat argued with somebody on her phone about lottery numbers. Price Time Repair sat between a tax office and a closed shoe store. The sign above the door had faded to a tired blue, and the painted clock on it showed 10 minutes to 2. In the window, watches rested on velvet pads beside handwritten cards. Batteries, bands, grandfather clocks, house calls by appointment. A bell rang when Annie pushed the door open. The shop smelled of metal, dust, coffee, and something sweet, maybe pipe tobacco from years before. Clocks covered the walls. Some ticked fast, some slow, some not at all. The sound should have been chaotic, but it settled around Annie like many old hearts, keeping different versions of the same hour. A man came from the back room wiping his hands on a cloth. Leonard Price was thin, brown-skinned, and stooped at the shoulders, with white hair cut close, and glasses hanging from a cord around his neck. He looked at Evelyn first. "Evelyn Brooks," he said. "If I'd known you were coming, I'd have hidden the good coffee." "You never had good coffee, Leonard." "That's so? You had strong coffee. There's a difference." He smiled, then turned to Annie, and the smile left without turning cold. "Miss Carter." "Yes, sir." He did not offer his hand right away. Instead, he looked at her face the way someone looks at a familiar road after many years, searching for what has changed and what has not. "You have Samuel's eyes," he said. "But your grandmother's patience, I hope. Your father had a temper when he was young." Annie had never heard anyone call her father young with such ease. In her memory, Samuel had always been tired, always careful with his breath, always measuring what the week would cost. "He didn't show much temper by the time I knew him," she said. "No," Leonard said. "Men who swallow enough fire either burn the world or burn quiet. Samuel chose quiet. I never agreed with him on that." Evelyn set her umbrella near the door. "We're here because quiet is done." Leonard nodded. "Come back here." He led them to a narrow work table beneath a lamp. Tiny screwdrivers, watch faces, springs, and gears were arranged in shallow trays. Beside them sat 3 mugs, as if he had expected exactly 2 visitors and planned for himself to need coffee during the telling. Annie placed the tin box on the table but kept one hand on the lid. Leonard saw that and nodded once. "Good, don't trust easy." She opened the box. First the debt note, flattened between cardboard. Then the photograph. Then the diary wrapped in flannel. Last, the broken pocket watch. Leonard reached toward the watch before anything else, then stopped with his fingers above it. "May I?" Annie hesitated, then handed it to him. His thumb moved over the tarnished case. "I wondered where this went. You know it? I sold it to Richard Whitmore for $12.50 in 1989. He wanted something that made him look like a man who kept appointments. Leonard turned the watch over. Samuel brought it back to me years later. Broken. Said he didn't want it fixed. Just wanted it to stay honest. What does that mean? Leonard opened the case. The hands were stopped at 217. His face changed. That was the time the bank stamped the payment. Annie's hand tightened on the edge of the table. The 42,000? Leonard nodded. The day Samuel paid Richard's debt. Evelyn sat slowly in the chair beside Annie. Start at the beginning, Leonard. There isn't one beginning, he said. There's the beginning Richard tells, the one Samuel lived, and the one the paperwork can prove. We'll use the paperwork first, because men like Whitmore respect paper more than memory until memory learns to bring copies. He opened a drawer beneath the table and took out a folder tied with string. The folder was old but clean, kept away from sunlight and damp. Annie saw handwriting across the front. Carter, Whitmore, 1991. Her breath caught. Leonard placed the folder on the table but did not open it yet. Your father asked me to keep duplicates. He said if anything happened to him, and if someday his girl came asking, I should decide whether she was strong enough to hear it. Annie looked at him. And? Leonard's eyes softened. You went to Whitmore's gate before you came to me. That answers it. He opened the folder. Inside were copies of checks, a lease agreement, a shop registration, a bank letter, and a photograph Annie had not seen before. In it, Samuel stood inside the repair bay beside a compressor, one hand resting on the machine, Richard beside him holding a clipboard. Leonard pointed to the shop registration, Carter and Whitmore Repair Company. Not incorporated the way Richard's empire later was, but registered with the county. Samuel's name first, because he had the trade license. Richard had charm and nerve. That was useful, but it didn't repair engines. Annie touched the edge of the copy. Why did Daddy never tell me his name was on the first business? Because after Richard made it big, the story changed. At first it was small omissions, then interviews, then speeches, then a company history printed on heavy paper that made no mention of Carter at all. Samuel could have challenged it. Why didn't he? Leonard looked at Evelyn, then back at Annie. Pride, weariness, and you. By then your mother was gone. He had bills. And fighting a rich man takes money, even when truth is free. Annie's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. What happened with the debt? Leonard pulled out the bank letter. Richard signed a supply contract he should never have touched. Cheap parts, rushed work, numbers that didn't match the shop's capacity. Samuel warned him. Richard said risk was how men got ahead. Then a warehouse job failed inspection after equipment broke down. Men were hurt. Not killed, thank God, but hurt enough. The contractor threatened suit. The bank called the note. Richard was exposed. Exposed how? He had used the shop's name and Samuel's license on documents Samuel had not approved. Annie felt Evelyn's hand cover hers. Leonard continued, if it went to court, Richard might have lost the shop and faced charges. Samuel could have cleared himself by letting Richard take the fall. Instead, he paid the settlement portion he could reach, signed a statement taking partial responsibility for oversight, and sold his truck to cover the rest. Why? Annie asked. Though she already knew some of it from the diary, Leonard's mouth tightened. Because Richard came to him crying. Not polite crying, broken crying. Said, if Samuel let him go down, everything he was trying to become would die before it started. Evelyn muttered, and Samuel believed there was still a soul in there worth saving. He did, Leonard said. That was his gift and his wound. Annie looked at the debt note. Richard signed this after Daddy paid? That same afternoon, right here in this shop. Here? Leonard nodded toward the front window. Rained that day too. Richard sat where Evelyn is. Samuel stood where you are. Richard wrote the note with my pen because his hands were shaking too badly to find his own. Annie looked around the shop. The clocks kept ticking. All this time, the room had been holding the scene. What did he say? She asked. Richard. Leonard folded his hands. He said, Sam, I'll make this right. I swear on my life. Samuel said. Don't swear on your life, Rich. Live one worth believing. Evelyn closed her eyes. Annie looked down at the table until the wood blurred. She would not cry. Not here. Not yet. Leonard pushed another paper toward her. This is the bank stamp, 2:17 p.m. That watch stopped within the hour. Richard threw it against the wall outside after Samuel refused to shake his hand. Samuel picked it up. Later he asked me to leave it broken. Why keep it? So he'd remember the exact hour a man can be saved and still choose to become worse. The bell over the door rang. All three of them turned. A man in a tailored overcoat stepped into the shop, shook rain from his sleeves, and looked around as if the place had already disappointed him. Victor Sloane's eyes moved from Leonard to Evelyn, then to Annie and the open folder on the table. Miss Carter, he said, Mr. Whitmore would like to resolve this before it becomes more painful for everyone. Leonard closed the folder with one flat hand. Annie stood. How did you know I was here? Victor offered a small smile. You mentioned Mr. Price in front of witnesses. That was unwise. Evelyn rose slowly beside Annie. Careful, counselor. Old women are witnesses too, and we last longer than men expect. Victor ignored her and placed a white envelope on the counter. There is a generous offer inside. More than generous, given the condition of your documents. Annie did not touch it. I didn't ask for an offer. No, Victor said. But you need one. Leonard's voice came dry, still talking like a man selling locks after robbing the house. Victor looked at him. Mr. Price, I would be careful about involving yourself in a matter you may not fully understand. Leonard tapped the folder. I understood it when Richard signed the note in my shop. For the first time, Victor's smile thinned. Annie picked up the tin box and held it against her coat. Tell Richard if he wants to resolve something, he can start by saying my father's name without choking on it. Victor's eyes hardened. You're making a mistake. No, Annie said. I'm finding out who made the first one. She walked past him toward the door, Evelyn close behind. Leonard called after her before she stepped into the rain. Miss Carter. Annie turned. He held up the folder. Copies. The originals stay with me until we know who can be trusted. Annie nodded. Outside, rain darkened the sidewalk and blurred the shop window behind her. Victor had come with an envelope. Leonard had given her a history. Richard had money, lawyers, a mansion, and a son beginning to ask questions. But Annie had the hour, 2:17, the minute her father paid another man's debt and lost the life he should have had. Victor's envelope stayed on the counter at Price Time Repair, white and clean against the dark wood, as if it had wandered into the wrong century. Annie left it there. So did Evelyn. Leonard locked the folder back in his drawer, turned the key twice, and told Victor the shop was closed. Outside, the rain had thinned to a cold mist. Annie and Evelyn walked to the bus stop without speaking. Evelyn's umbrella clicked softly each time it caught a gust. Annie held the tin box under her coat, pressed against her ribs. The broken watch inside seemed heavier now that she knew what time it carried. At the stop, Evelyn finally said, He followed fast. Victor, men like that don't follow. They're sent. Annie looked down the street. Richard sent him. Maybe. Or Victor sent himself before Richard could do something foolish, like tell the truth. Annie thought of Richard's face when the photograph came out. Then the way he turned silent when Leonard's name was spoken. He knows all of it. Not all, Evelyn said. A man can bury a thing so long he forgets the shape, but he still knows where the ground is soft. The bus arrived, brakes hissing. Annie climbed on after Evelyn and took the seat by the window. She expected to feel stronger with Leonard's proof behind her. Instead, the story had grown too large for her hands. It was no longer only a debt note, no longer only a diary. There was a shop registration, a bank stamp, a broken watch, a settlement, a license used without permission, and a man who had been saved at 2:17 only to walk away from the person who saved him. When they reached Annie's block, a black sedan was parked across from her house. Evelyn saw it too. Keep walking normal. I am walking normal. No, you're walking like you want to throw a brick. Annie slowed. The sedan's windows were dark, but the engine was off. Nobody stepped out. On her front porch, the yellow notice was still fixed to the door, edges curling from the damp. Evelyn touched Annie's elbow. You stay with me tonight. I need to pack. You need witnesses. Boxes don't testify, Annie almost argued, then saw the curtain move in the house 2 doors down. Mrs. Alvarez, who had known Samuel for years, was watching. Across the street, Mr. Donnelly stood under his awning, pretending to shake out a rug. The block had noticed the sedan. That helped. A man opened the car door. It was not Victor. He was younger, wearing a gray coat and carrying a manila folder. "Miss Carter?" he called. Evelyn muttered, "Here we go." Annie stayed on the sidewalk. "Who's asking?" "My name is Paul Jennings. I work with Sloan and Mercer, Mr. Whitmore's legal counsel. Then you can talk from there." He glanced at Evelyn, then back to Annie. "Mr. Sloan asked me to deliver documents. I'm not taking anything. This concerns the property." Annie's stomach tightened. "What property?" "The rental home." He opened the folder and removed several stapled pages. "Our office contacted the owner regarding outstanding rent and removal terms. Mr. Whitmore is prepared to settle the balance and arrange temporary lodging, provided you agree to a private meeting and refrain from further contact with third parties about these allegations." Evelyn gave a dry laugh. He put a leash inside a helping hand. Paul's face reddened. "Ma'am, I'm only delivering." "Then deliver yourself back to the car." Annie looked at the papers but did not reach for them. "He wants to pay my rent now?" "It is an act of goodwill." "No," Annie said. "It's a broom. He wants to sweep me somewhere quiet." Paul lowered his voice. "Miss Carter, you're 18. You're facing eviction. Whatever you think happened between your father and Mr. Whitmore, you should consider practical options." Evelyn stepped closer. "Young man, practical is what poor folks do every day before rich folks wake up. Don't preach it like you invented survival." Paul had no answer for that. Annie said, "Tell Mr. Sloan I already have a meeting." "With whom?" "With Memory." Evelyn's mouth twitched. Paul's patience thinned. "If you continue making unsupported claims, Mr. Whitmore's team may have no choice but to protect his reputation." "His reputation survived my father's poverty just fine," Annie said. "It can survive a question." Paul closed the folder. "You're being advised." "No, I'm being warned. There's a difference." He returned to the sedan. Annie waited until it drove off before she let out the breath she had been holding. From 2 porches down, Mrs. Alvarez called, "Annie, you need anything?" Annie turned. The older woman wore a red cardigan and house slippers, her arms folded tight against the cold. "No, ma'am, thank you." "You sure?" "Your daddy fixed my furnace 3 winters in a row and never charged enough," Mr. Donnelly added from across the street. "He got my Chevy running after 2 shops gave up. If somebody's bothering you, you say so." The words moved down the block in small ways. A door opening, a curtain lifting, a man Annie barely knew pausing with a trash bag in his hand. None of them could fight Richard Whitmore in court. None of them owned a mansion gate or a legal firm. But they remembered Samuel Carter in the language of ordinary help. A furnace, a car, a sink, a ride. A winter evening when he came out after supper because somebody needed him. Annie felt her throat tighten. Evelyn spoke for her. "She's got people watching. That's enough for today." Inside Annie's house, the cold had deepened. She packed more of her father's things, while Evelyn made phone calls from the kitchen. Not loud calls. Church calls. Neighbor calls. The kind that began with, "I don't want to gossip, but I do need folks to know," and ended with another person promising to listen. Annie found Samuel's work gloves in a coffee can near the basement stairs. The leather had cracked at the fingers. She slipped one hand inside and felt the shape his hand had left there. For a moment she could see him at the kitchen table, turning a bolt between his fingers while explaining something simple and true. "Machines don't lie, Annie," he had once told her. "They fail for reasons. People just get better at hiding theirs." She folded the gloves and put them in the tin box. By late afternoon, Evan called. Annie did not recognize the number and nearly ignored it. Evelyn saw her face and said, "Answer." "Put it on speaker." Annie did. "Annie, it's Evan Whitmore." Evelyn lifted her eyebrows but said nothing. Annie held the phone between them. "How did you get my number?" "Leonard Price gave it to me." That made Annie pause. "He did?" "He said if I was calling to threaten you, he'd print my number on a church bulletin and let every old lady in Baltimore handle me." Evelyn nodded. "Leonard still has sense." Evan exhaled. I'm not calling to threaten you. Then why are you calling? My father and Victor are arguing behind closed doors. Victor says you're fabricating documents. My father told him to shut up. Annie sat on the edge of a box. Evan continued. That doesn't mean he admitted anything, but I've never heard him speak to Victor that way. What do you want from me? The diary, Evan said. Not to take. I want to read one entry, something that proves my father knew yours beyond that picture. No. Annie, no. Your family's lawyer already tried to put a price on my rent today. Then he sent somebody with papers. Now you call asking for the diary. You may mean well, Evan. But meaning well has done a lot of damage in your house. There was quiet on the line. Then Evan said, I'm sorry about the papers. I didn't know. Now you do. I found something, he said. Evelyn leaned closer. What? Annie asked. In my father's office. Behind some framed awards. There's an old key on a ring. The tag says C and W, Bay, 3. Annie looked at Evelyn. Evan said, Does that mean anything? Evelyn whispered, Carter and Whitmore. Annie's voice steadied. Don't give that key to Victor. I wasn't planning to. Don't show your father yet either. He's my father, and mine kept your father's secrets for decades. We both know fathers can be wrong. Evan did not answer right away. What do I do? Annie looked at the tin box, at the gloves, at the watch, stopped at 2:17. Meet me tomorrow morning at Leonard's shop. Bring the key. Victor will find out. Then don't bring Victor. And my father? Annie thought of Richard refusing the paper. Richard losing color at the photograph. Richard saying the word complicated as if it could replace truth. Not yet, she said. Let him wonder what else his house forgot to hide. After she hung up, Evelyn poured fresh coffee and set a mug beside Annie. You trust the boy? Evelyn asked. No. But he asked what to do. Evelyn sat across from her. That's where some people begin. That night, Annie stayed at Evelyn's, the tin box beside the couch. Rain ticked against the window. Across town, Evan Whitmore had a key marked C and W Bay 3. Somewhere in Richard's mansion, a father was arguing with the man paid to protect his lies. And on Harford Road, Leonard Price had copies of a truth that was learning how to travel. Annie closed her eyes but did not sleep quickly. The debt had started as a paper. Now it had a key. Evan arrived at Pricetime Repair 10 minutes before 9. Wearing a baseball cap pulled low and a jacket that cost more than Annie's monthly rent. He stood outside the shop with his hands in his pockets, trying to look casual and failing. The street was too honest for that. Harford Road had a way of making rich people's disguises seem louder than their clothes. Annie saw him from the bus window before it stopped. Mrs. Evelyn saw him too. Well, Evelyn said, gathering her purse. The boy came. He could still be here for his father. Could be. That's why God gave us eyes and old women gave us suspicion. They stepped off the bus. Evan straightened when he saw Annie, then nodded to Evelyn with a politeness that seemed practiced but not false. Mrs. Brooks, he said. Evelyn looked him over. You remember my name? That's either manners or nerves. Both, ma'am. Good. Nerves mean your conscience is awake. Annie stopped in front of him. You brought it? Evan reached into his jacket and took out a small brass key on a metal ring. A paper tag hung from it, browned at the edges, with 3 letters written in faded ink. C and W. Bay. 3. Annie did not touch it at first. Where exactly did you find it? In my father's office. There's a wall of framed awards behind his desk. One frame was crooked. I fixed it and saw a small panel behind it. The key was inside with some old receipts and a photograph of a garage door. Did your father know? No. Victor? No. Evelyn gave a soft hum. That may be the first sensible thing a Whitmore has done before breakfast. The bell over Pricetime Repair rang before Annie could answer. Leonard Price opened the door and looked at Evan through thick glasses. You're early. Yes, sir. Rich folks often are when guilt drives. Leonard stepped aside. Come in before somebody sees you trying to become useful. Inside, the clocks were already talking over one another. Evan seemed unsettled by the sound. Annie understood. The shop did not feel like a place where time was kept. It felt like a place where time gave testimony. Leonard locked the door after them and turned the sign to closed. Evan noticed. Is that necessary? For my peace, yes. For your lawyer, absolutely. Leonard pointed to the work table. Key. Evan placed it on the table. Leonard did not pick it up right away. He bent close, reading the tag, then removed his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth. Bay 3, he said. Annie's pulse changed. You know what it opens? I know what it opened. Leonard looked at Evan. Whether it still does depends on whether your father had the sense to leave the past alone. Evan swallowed. What was Bay 3? Leonard sat slowly. Carter and Whitmore rented 3 bays at the old Ashland machine yard. Bay 1 was customer work. Bay 2 was storage. Bay 3 was where Samuel kept the books Richard didn't like. Evan frowned. Books as in accounting? Accounting. Contracts. Parts orders. Safety notes. Anything that showed Samuel was more than the man Richard later turned him into. Annie leaned forward. Did Daddy keep records there? He did until the partnership broke. After the debt was paid, he cleared most of it out. But not all. Why not? Leonard looked at the key. Because Samuel believed a man deserves one chance to come back and tell the truth on his own. He left some things where Richard could find them if he ever became brave enough. Evelyn folded her arms. That was generous to a fault. That was Samuel, Leonard said. Evan stared at the key as if it had become heavier. My father kept it. Yes, Leonard said. That matters. How? A guilty man throws away what can condemn him. A haunted man keeps it close. No one spoke for a moment. Annie touched the tin box beside her chair. Where is the machine yard now? Still standing, Leonard said. Barely. East side. Behind the old rail spur. Most of it got bought by a storage company. Bay 3 is in the rear building. Evan looked up. We should go. Annie turned to him. We? I brought the key, and your last name brought the problem. He took that without arguing. Then let me use it for something else. Evelyn looked at Leonard. You think the place is safe to enter? Leonard gave her a look over his glasses. Safe? It's an old machine yard, not a church social. But if we go in daylight and don't act foolish, we'll manage. Annie shook her head. You're not coming. Leonard laughed once. Miss Carter, I have been waiting 30 years to see if Samuel's loose ends still have knots. I'm coming. You're old. So are most good tools. Evelyn lifted her purse. And I'm coming too. No, Annie said. Mrs. Evelyn, don't Mrs. Evelyn me. Your father fixed my furnace in a snowstorm after his own cough had him bent double. I can sit in a car and watch a door. Evan looked between them. Should I call my driver? All 3 of them turned to him. He flushed. That sounded bad. It sounded like money asking to be helpful and not knowing how, Evelyn said. Can you drive yourself? Yes, ma'am. Then do that. They left the shop through the back door to avoid the front window. Evan's car was parked 2 blocks away, a dark sedan with leather seats and a dashboard that lit up when he opened the doors. Annie hesitated before getting in. She had ridden in nice cars before only when cleaning jobs required it, and even then she sat like she might be charged for breathing on the upholstery. Evelyn climbed into the back first. Don't stand there judging the seats. We have somewhere to be. Annie got in beside her. Leonard took the front passenger seat, holding the key in one hand like a small verdict. The drive east took them past parts of Baltimore tourists did not photograph. Closed warehouses, corner churches, vacant lots, murals fading under soot, brick buildings with windows boarded from the inside. Evan drove quietly, both hands on the wheel. Every so often, he glanced at the rearview mirror, not at traffic but at Annie. Finally, she said, Ask it. He blinked. Ask what? Whatever you keep wanting to ask. Evan's hands tightened. Was your father angry at mine? Annie thought of the diary, of Samuel's words leaning forward on the page. Yes. Evan nodded as if he deserved that. But not only angry, she added. What else? Disappointed. That seemed worse. Evan kept his eyes on the road. My father talks about loyalty all the time. My father lived it. The car went quiet again. The old Ashland machine yard appeared behind a sagging chain-link fence. The sign was rusted, but the outline of its letters remained. Several buildings sat beyond the gate, long and low, their brick darkened by rain and years. A storage company banner hung on the front office. but the rear building looked untouched. Evan parked near the side entrance. Leonard pointed with the key. Bay 3 is around back. They walked together over cracked pavement. Evelyn stayed close to Annie, though she had insisted she was only there to watch. A stray newspaper blew against the fence and stuck there. Somewhere beyond the rail spur, a horn sounded from traffic. Bay 3 had a metal door with peeling green paint. The old lock was stiff with rust. Leonard handed the key to Annie. "Your father's thread," he said. "You pull it." Annie took the key. Her fingers shook once, then steadied. She slid it into the lock. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the metal gave with a hard click. Evan exhaled. Annie pushed the door open. Dust rose in a slow cloud. Inside, the bay smelled of oil, old paper, and cold concrete. A workbench stood against the far wall. A broken stool lay on its side. Shelves held coffee cans, machine parts, brittle folders, and a metal cash box. On the back wall, under layers of grime, someone had written in black marker, "Build it clean, Rich." Leonard whispered, "Samuel." Annie stepped inside. The words on the wall did what Richard's mansion could not. They brought her father close without making him small. She could picture him here, sleeves rolled, jaw set, writing that sentence for a friend who wanted speed more than honor. Evan stood beside her, looking at the wall. "My father kept the key to this place." "Yes," Annie said. "Why?" Leonard opened one of the brittle folders on the shelf. Because somewhere in him, he knew Samuel had left a door open. Evelyn called from near the workbench. "Annie." Annie crossed to her. Evelyn pointed to the underside of the bench, where a tin plate had been screwed over a narrow compartment. Leonard handed Annie a screwdriver from the shelf. The screws resisted, then loosened one by one. Inside was an envelope wrapped in wax paper. Annie lifted it out. On the front, in Samuel's handwriting, were 4 words. "If Richard comes back." Evan's face tightened. Annie opened the envelope with care. Inside were copies of contracts, a bank receipt, and one letter addressed to Richard Whitmore but never mailed. Annie unfolded it. Her father's words filled the page. "Rich, if you are reading this, then some part of you made it back to the truth. I paid what you owed because I remembered the man you were before wanting more. Became your religion. But understand me, I did not pay it because you were innocent. I paid it because I could not let the worst thing you did be the end of you. Don't make it the beginning instead." Annie stopped reading. Her throat had closed. Evan took one step back, as if the letter had reached him too. Leonard removed his hat. Evelyn put a hand on Annie's shoulder. Then a sound came from outside. A car door. Another one. Evan moved toward the bay entrance and looked out. His face changed. "What?" Annie asked. He turned back. "Victor," he said, "and my father." Victor Sloan stepped out first, closing the car door with care, as if even an abandoned machine yard deserved proper manners when he arrived to ruin something. Richard Whitmore came from the other side of the sedan. He wore no overcoat, only a dark suit, and the wind moved at his jacket. He looked toward Bay 3, then toward Evan. And for the first time since Annie had met him, he did not look in control of the ground beneath him. Evan stood in the doorway. "Did you follow me?" Richard's answer came after a pause. "I followed the car. That's the same thing. You took a key from my office. You hid a key from your life." Victor came up beside Richard. "Evan, step away from the building." "No, this is private property." Leonard Price walked to the door. Slow, but firm. "Funny thing about old places, counselor. Men who abandon them get sentimental when somebody else opens the lock." Victor looked past him into the bay. His eyes found Annie, the envelope in her hand, the open compartment under the workbench. Anything removed from this site may be subject to ownership claims. Evelyn gave a short laugh from behind Annie. "There it is. A man sees a dead friend's letter and starts looking for a receipt." Richard's gaze had not left the back wall. "Build it clean, Rich." The words were faded, but not enough. Annie saw him read them. His mouth tightened. His eyes moved once to the floor, then back to the wall as if the sentence had called him by a name no one had used in years. Annie held up the envelope. "You kept the key." Richard looked at her then. "You had no right to come here. My father left a letter here for you. That doesn't answer what right you had." "No, Annie said. It answers why you never came. Victor stepped forward. Do not hand anything to him. Richard, I mean it. We need to establish chain of custody. Leonard turned on him. This isn't a murder trial. It's a conscience. Victor ignored him. Miss Carter, place the envelope on the bench and step away. Annie folded the letter once, carefully, and held it against her chest. No. Richard's voice came rough. What does it say? Annie looked at him for a long moment. You want me to read it? No, Victor said. Richard said, yes. Victor's head snapped toward him. Richard. Richard did not look away from Annie. Read it. Annie unfolded the page. Her hands were steady now. Steadier than they had been at the mansion gate. Maybe because this place did not belong to Richard's version of the world. It belonged to oil, work, rust, and men who made things with hands they could not afford to injure. She read, Rich, if you are reading this, then some part of you made it back to the truth. I paid what you owed because I remembered the man you were before wanting more became your religion. But understand me, I did not pay it because you were innocent. I paid it because I could not let the worst thing you did be the end of you. Don't make it the beginning instead. Richard closed his eyes. Victor muttered, This is sentimental nonsense. Evan turned toward him. Be quiet. Victor stiffened. Excuse me? I said be quiet. Richard opened his eyes, but he did not correct his son. Annie continued. If the day comes when you are ready to say my name without shame, start by telling the truth about the shop. Tell them it was not yours alone. Tell them I warned you about the parts. Tell them I signed what I signed to keep you from prison, not because I failed at my trade. Tell them I forgave the boy I called brother, but I do not forgive the man who lets that mercy become a ladder. The last word seemed to strike the room harder than the others. Richard stepped into the bay. Dust marked the shine of his shoes. He looked at the workbench, the shelves, the old stool, the words on the wall. Annie wondered if he saw the same place she saw, or if another room had risen over it in his mind. Brighter lights, a younger Samuel, a younger Richard, the sound of machines and ordinary hope. Evan's voice was low. Dad, is it true? Richard did not answer. Victor jumped in. Evan, memories are unreliable. Old letters are not legal proof. Your father built an organization that employs thousands. We are not going to let a handwritten note from decades ago. Did Samuel Carter sign papers to protect my father? Evan asked. Victor's face changed by half an inch, which was enough. Evan saw it. You knew. Victor looked at Richard. This is exactly why I wanted to handle it before it got out of control. Richard spoke at last. How long have you known? Victor's confidence returned in a thinner form. I knew there were legacy issues. Your father had already settled them internally. By the time I came in. My father? Evan said. You mean Granddad? Victor's mouth pressed shut. Annie looked from Victor to Richard. There's more. Richard's head turned toward her. My father wrote that someone came to see him years later. A Whitmore lawyer. Not you. Not your father. A lawyer. He offered him money to sign another statement saying he had never been a founding partner. Richard's face shifted. I didn't know that. Victor said quickly. There were many cleanup efforts during the restructuring period. I can't speak to every document. Leonard took a folder from beneath his arm. I can. Victor's eyes narrowed. Mr. Price. Leonard held up a copy. Samuel brought me this after the visit. Didn't sign it. Kept the copy. It says Samuel Carter performed occasional contract labor for an early Whitmore-affiliated repair operation. Contract labor. That's what they tried to make him. Evelyn's voice cut through the bay. A founder turned into hired hands. That's an old trick. Annie looked at Richard. Did you send that lawyer? Richard shook his head once, but not with contempt this time. With strain. No. Do you expect me to believe that? No, he said. I don't. The honesty landed strangely. It did not absolve him. It made the air heavier. Evan stepped closer to his father. Then say what you do know. Richard looked at the wall again. Build it clean, Rich. His shoulders seemed to settle under a weight that had been waiting for him. I knew Samuel signed something after the warehouse failure, Richard said. I knew he paid money he should never have paid. I knew I promised to pay him back. Victor said. Richard, Stop, Richard went on, quieter. I also knew when reporters started calling me self-made. I didn't correct them. Annie felt Evelyn's hand in her arm. Evan's face tightened. That's it? You let everybody erase him because it was easier? Richard looked at his son. At first, I told myself I would fix it when the company was secure. And then? Then security became the excuse for everything. The bay fell quiet except for the wind pressing through cracks in the metal door. Victor recovered first. This confession, if that is what we are calling it, is incomplete and legally dangerous. Richard, you need counsel before you say another word. Richard turned to him. I have had counsel for 25 years. That is precisely why you still have a company. No, Richard said. It may be why I still have a lie. Victor's face went hard. Think carefully. I am. Annie watched him, unwilling to trust the turn. Guilt could sound like truth when it first came loose. Rich men could cry in one room and deny in the next. Her father had paid too much for her to be moved by a few cracked sentences. She handed the letter to Leonard, not Richard. Make a copy. Leonard nodded. Richard looked at the paper as it left her hand. May I read it? Annie met his eyes. Not alone. He accepted that with a small nod. Evan said, What happens now? Annie picked up the broken watch from the tin box and held it out so Richard could see the stopped hands. Do you remember this? Richard's face changed more than it had at the letter. Yes. Leonard said it stopped at 2:17. The hour my father paid your debt. Richard looked at the watch as if time itself had been waiting in Annie's palm. You threw it, Leonard said. Against the wall outside my shop. Samuel picked it up after you left. Richard's voice nearly failed. I remember. Annie closed her hand around the watch. Then remember the rest before somebody else has to drag it out of you. Victor stepped between them. This has gone far enough. Miss Carter, any further publication of these materials will be met with legal action. Evelyn moved before Annie could, planting herself in front of Victor with her purse tucked over one arm. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Young man, she said, though Victor was not young. I have buried a husband, a sister, and more neighbors than I care to count. I have watched men with money turn shame into paperwork since before you bought your first good shoes. You can threaten this girl, but you will not scare every old person in this city who remembers Samuel Carter. Victor's eyes flicked toward Richard, hoping for support. Richard gave none. Evan looked at Annie. What do you need? Annie almost said nothing. Pride rose first, quick and familiar. But this was not about refusing help to prove strength. Her father had carried too much by himself. I need the company history, she said. The official one, the first one that left my father out. Evan nodded. I can get it. Victor said, You will do no such thing. Evan looked at Richard. Dad? Richard was quiet a moment. Then he reached into his pocket, removed a ring of keys, and took one off. He placed it on the workbench. My private archive, he said, at the house, lower library cabinet. Victor stared at him. Richard's eyes stayed on Annie. There are early company materials there. Speeches, drafts, old articles. Why should I trust you? Annie asked. You shouldn't, Richard said. Trust the key. Annie did not pick it up. Effon dit. I'll bring it, he said. Richard did not stop him. Outside, another gust shook the bay door. Annie placed the watch back in the tin box, then closed the lid. Bay 3 had given them more than documents. It had brought Richard Whitmore into a room where his wealth had no place to sit. As they stepped out into the pale afternoon, Annie looked once more at the words on the wall. Build it clean, Rich. For 25 years, Richard had not. Now the question was whether a dirty truth, finally uncovered, could still be used to build something honest. Evan did not go back to the mansion with his father. That alone told Annie something. Richard left Bay 3 inches Victor's car, not because Victor had won, but because the two men needed a closed space for whatever fight came next. Richard paused before getting in. His hand rested on the open door, and for a moment he looked as if he might say something to Annie. He didn't. Maybe he had no words yet that were not either too small or too late. Then the car pulled away, its tires cutting through shallow rainwater, and the old machine yard seemed to breathe again. Evan stood beside his own car with the archive key in his hand. Leonard watched him over the top of his glasses. You understand what that key means? It opens a cabinet, Evan said. No, Evelyn said. It opens your father's version of himself. Those are harder to close. Evan looked at Annie. I'll bring the materials to Leonard's shop. When? Tonight if I can. Victor had warned them against publication, but Annie knew men like Victor feared more than newspapers. They feared old people with copies, sons with questions, and young women who had stopped asking permission to be believed. Don't go through it alone, she said. Evan gave a faint, tired smile. You worried about me now? No. I'm worried you'll miss something because you were raised to admire the handwriting. That seemed to land. He nodded. Fair. Leonard gave him a piece of paper with a number written in blue ink. Call the shop phone when you have the box. If I don't answer, call Evelyn. If she doesn't answer, call again. Because she ignores phones when she feels like making a point. Evelyn sniffed. A phone is an invitation, not a command. For the first time that day, Evan laughed softly. Then he put the archive key in his pocket and drove off toward the part of town where gates opened quietly for his last name. Annie rode back with Evelyn and Leonard in Leonard's old pickup. The truck smelled of leather, dust, and peppermint candies. Leonard drove slowly, both hands on the wheel, muttering at drivers who treated red lights like suggestions. Annie sat by the window with the tin box on her lap and watched the city shift around them. The machine yard gave way to warehouses, then row houses, then streets where people carried groceries, pushed laundry carts, waited for buses, held umbrellas over one another without making ceremony of it. At Evelyn's house, Leonard came inside for coffee. He said it was because the rain was picking up. Evelyn said it was because he wanted pie. Both were true. Annie placed the tin box on the kitchen table. The room had become their headquarters without anyone naming it. Evelyn cleared space between a bowl of apples and a stack of church envelopes. Leonard laid out a legal pad and wrote in careful block letters. Debt note, photograph, diary, bank stamp, watch, bay, 3-letter, archive key. Evelyn looked at the list. Looks like bones. Leonard nodded. That's what a buried truth is, if you find enough pieces. Annie sat with her hands around a mug of coffee she had not touched. What if Richard changes his mind? He will, Evelyn said. Annie looked up. Evelyn cut a slice of sweet potato pie and set it in front of Leonard. Not all the way, maybe. But men who have lived safe inside a lie don't walk out once and stay out. They step back. They check the weather. They look for a coat. Leonard picked up his fork. Victor will be that coat. So what do we do? Annie asked. We make sure the truth doesn't depend on Richard's courage, Leonard said. Courage comes and goes in men like him. Paper stays if you copy it. Memory stays if enough people speak it. Evelyn pointed at Annie's phone. Call Mrs. Alvarez. Annie frowned. Why? Because she remembers your father fixing her furnace. Donnelly remembers the Chevy. Reverend Hayes remembers who kept the church boiler alive. You don't build a case with feelings, but you don't build a community without them either. I don't want people dragged into this. Baby girl, they were already in it. Every time Samuel helped someone while carrying what Richard owed, this block became part of the account. Annie thought of her father's hands, the way he always came home with some new cut or burn he claimed was nothing. She had once asked him why he kept helping people who could not pay. He told her, because not having money shouldn't mean not having anybody. She called Mrs. Alvarez. By 6, Evelyn's kitchen had 3 more chairs pulled in from the back porch. Mrs. Alvarez came with a plastic container of arroz con polo and a folder of furnace receipts Samuel had refused to total properly. Mr. Donnelly came with an old photograph of Samuel leaning over the hood of his Chevy, smiling with a wrench in one hand. Reverend Hayes arrived in a brown raincoat, carrying a small Bible and a church maintenance ledger that showed years of repairs marked S. Carter paid in full, even when no payment had been made. Annie looked at the table, filling with proof of a man's life, and felt grief shift its weight. Mrs. Alvarez touched her shoulder. Your daddy never let my house freeze. I don't know what rich man trouble you're in, but I know Samuel Carter was honest. Mr. Donnelly nodded. He could have charged me triple and I'd have paid it. He didn't. Reverend Hayes opened the ledger. Your father used to say a church should not sound cold when people came in from the world. He kept that boiler running through winters it had no business surviving. Leonard added their names to the legal pad. Annie said, This isn't about making Daddy look nice. No, Reverend Hayes said. It's about showing he had a name before Mr. Whitmore decided it was inconvenient. The word inconvenient made Annie think of Evan. In the Whitmore house, Samuel had become an inconvenience. On this block, he remained a man people could measure by warmth, engines, repaired steps, rides to appointments, and quiet bills marked lower than they should have been. At 7:30, Evan called. Annie put him on speaker. "I have the archive box," he said, his voice low. Leonard leaned closer. "Where are you?" "In my car, not far from your shop." "Did anyone see you take it?" Annie asked. "My father did." The kitchen went silent. Evan continued. "He didn't stop me. Victor, he was there too. He tried." Evelyn folded her arms. "What did Richard say?" Evan drew a breath. "Victor said, removing company materials could expose us to liability." My father said, "Then maybe liability is what we have left instead of honor." No one spoke for a moment. Annie did not let herself soften too much. "Bring the box to Evelyn's house, not the shop." "Why?" "Because the shop is known now. Victor went there once. I don't want him walking in with another envelope. Send me the address." Evelyn gave it. 20 minutes later, headlights moved across Evelyn's front curtains. Annie stood, but Reverend Hayes raised a hand. "I'll answer." He opened the door before Evan could knock. Evan came in carrying a banker's box sealed with old packing tape. His eyes moved around the kitchen. The neighbors, the food, the ledger, the legal pad, the tin box. For once, he had entered a room where his last name did not explain him. Evelyn took his wet jacket. "You eat?" "I'm not hungry." That wasn't the question. Annie almost laughed despite herself. Evan looked confused, then accepted a plate because everyone in the kitchen seemed to know refusal would not help him. He set the archive box on the table. Leonard cut the tape with a pocket knife. Inside were folders labeled in Richard's neat handwriting. Early press, founder speeches, company timeline, personal drafts, Bay lease, Carter. At the last label, Annie's chest tightened. Evan saw it. "I didn't open that one." "Why not?" "It wasn't mine to open first." Annie pulled the Carter folder from the box. Her fingers brushed the tab where Richard had written her father's name. Not Samuel. Not Sam. Carter. A file category. Still, it was there. Inside were clippings, copies of agreements, and drafts of speeches with lines crossed out. Leonard spread them gently across the table. One draft caught Annie's eye. It was an early speech from a small business award dinner. Richard had written by hand in the margin. "Mention Sam." "Too complicated." The room went still. Evan read it and put a hand over his mouth. Evelyn said softly, "There's that word again." Annie picked up the page. The handwriting was Richard's, strong and slanted. "Mention Sam." Too complicated. 4 words had weighed more than any insult at the gate. Not forgotten. Considered. Removed. "He made a choice," Annie said. Leonard nodded. "Yes." Evan's voice was strained. "This was before I was born." Annie looked at him. "That doesn't make it lighter." "I know." She turned another page. A later company timeline listed Richard Whitmore as sole founder. The first shop was described as a modest rented repair bay, where Richard Whitmore began servicing industrial clients. No Samuel, no Carter, no license, no truck sold. No 217. Reverend Hayes spoke quietly. "That is how erasure works. Not always with hatred. Sometimes with a cleaner sentence." Annie sat back, the paper in her hand. The kitchen felt warmer than it had any right to be, crowded with food, raincoats, old receipts, and people who had decided Samuel Carter's name would not be carried by Annie alone. Then Evan reached into the archive box again and pulled out a small cassette tape. "What is that?" Annie asked. Evan read the label. Richard. Private notes. Founders dinner rehearsal. Leonard stood so quickly his chair scraped. "I have a tape player in the truck." Evelyn looked at Annie. "You ready?" Annie looked at the tape, then at the debt note beside the tin box. Ready had nothing to do with it. "Play it," she said. Leonard brought in the old player, set it on the kitchen table, and pressed the button. The tape hissed, clicked, Then Richard's younger voice filled the room. I should mention Sam. I know I should. Without Samuel Carter, there would be no first bay, no first contract, no second chance after the warehouse. But the story is cleaner without him. God forgive me, it is cleaner. No one moved. On the tape, Richard breathed hard, then laughed once, bitter and low. Maybe one day I'll fix it. The recording clicked into silence. Annie lowered her eyes to the table. The room had given her what she feared and needed most. Richard's own voice. Not denying Samuel, but choosing to leave him out. Evan looked broken open in a quiet way. I'm sorry, he said. Annie did not answer right away. She folded the speech draft and placed it beside the tape. Don't be sorry yet, she said. Be useful. Evan nodded. Outside, rain ran along the window glass. Inside, Evelyn's kitchen held 2 boxes now, 1 tin, 1 cardboard. One from a poor man's basement, one from a rich man's archive. Between them lay the distance Richard Whitmore had spent a lifetime pretending did not exist. And for the first time, that distance had a voice. The tape sat in the center of Evelyn's kitchen table like a thing that could still speak if anyone dared press the button again. Nobody did. Richard's younger voice had already filled the room once, and once had been enough to change the weight of every paper around it. Annie kept her hand near the tin box, not touching it. Across from her, Evan looked at the tape as if it had come from inside his own chest. He had arrived with an archive box and the nervous courage of a son who wanted answers. Now he had heard his father choose a cleaner lie over a loyal friend. Reverend Hayes was the first to move. He took off his glasses, wiped them with a handkerchief, and said, That recording needs to be copied tonight. Leonard nodded. I can do it. I still have equipment at the shop. Evelyn pointed at him. You are not taking that tape anywhere alone. I've been crossing streets by myself for 81 years. And look how cocky it made you. Annie would have smiled on another night. Instead, she looked at Evan. Did your father know that tape was in the box? I don't know. His voice was low. Maybe. Maybe he forgot. No, Evelyn said. Men forget birthdays. They do not forget themselves confessing. Evan flinched, but he did not argue. Annie picked up the speech draft with Richard's handwriting in the margin. Mention Sam? Too complicated. She read the words again until they stopped looking like ink and started looking like a decision. Her father's whole life after Richard had been treated as an inconvenience in the sentence of another man's success. Mrs. Alvarez pushed the plate of Arrows con polo closer to Annie. Eat a little. I can't. You can. You just don't want to. Evelyn gave a satisfied nod. I like her. Annie took one bite because refusing food from grieving neighbors was its own kind of disrespect. The rice was warm, and the warmth reminded her she was still in a kitchen, still among living people, not buried under the documents of the dead. Evan stood abruptly. I need to call him. Annie looked up. Your father? Yes. Leonard shook his head. Bad idea. He needs to know what I found. He knows what he made, Evelyn said. Evan held the back of a chair. You all keep talking about him like he's some stranger. He's my father. If there's any chance he's ready to tell the truth, I have to give him that chance. Annie heard the hurt beneath the defense. She knew something about defending a father, though hers had left behind pain of a different kind. Put it on speaker, she said. Evan looked at her. What? If you call him, put it on speaker. No private cleanup. Victor's phrase seemed to move through the kitchen without being spoken. Resolve this. Annie was learning how rich people used privacy as a broom. Evan nodded and dialed. The phone rang 4 times before Richard answered. Evan. Dad, I found the archive box. A pause. I know. I heard the tape. The line went quiet long enough for everyone in the kitchen to hear the rain sliding against the window. Richard's voice came back lower. Where are you? With Annie. Victor's voice cut in from somewhere near Richard. Evan, listen carefully. Do not discuss archival material outside counsel. Evan closed his eyes for a second. I'm tired of hearing him instead of you, Richard said. Victor, leave the room. Richard, leave. A door closed on the other end. Maybe it was real. Maybe it was another performance. Annie could not tell. She watched Evan's face instead. Richard spoke again. You should not have taken that box. I know, but you gave me the key. I gave Annie the key. You gave it where I could pick it up. Another silence. Evan's voice changed. You recorded yourself saying there would be no company without Samuel Carter. You said the story was cleaner without him. Did you mean it? Richard did not answer quickly. Annie could feel Evelyn beside her, still and listening. Yes, Richard said at last. Evan's face tightened. Which part? All of it. The kitchen held its breath. Annie leaned toward the phone. Then say his name. Richard did not speak. Evan looked at Annie, then back at the phone. Dad. Richard's voice came with effort. Samuel Carter. Annie felt the name move through her, not as relief, not yet, but as something her father had been owed in the open air. Richard continued. Samuel Carter helped me when I had nothing. He had the trade license. He had the skill. I had ambition and not enough judgment. Leonard muttered. That's one way to phrase theft. Evelyn elbowed him. Richard heard enough to know he was not alone on the line. Who is there? Annie answered. People who remember him. Richard's breath shifted. Annie, I need to speak with you. You are. Not like this. This is exactly like this. Evan said. Dad, did Samuel pay the $42,000? Yes. The word was small, but it struck hard. Mrs. Alvarez crossed herself. Mr. Donnelly looked down at his hands. Reverend Hayes shut his eyes. Annie's voice stayed even. Why didn't you pay him back? Richard's answer came slowly. At first, I told myself I couldn't. Then I told myself I would. Then the company grew, and paying him meant explaining why. Explaining why meant admitting what I'd done. After enough time passed, I let the silence become the arrangement. No, Annie said. Silence was not an arrangement. It was something you could afford. Evan whispered, Annie. She did not stop. My father could not afford it. He paid with his truck, his license, his name, his health, his daughter packing his life into boxes while your lawyer offers rent money like a bandage over a grave. Richard's voice thinned. Victor went to your house? Your office did. I didn't authorize that. Evelyn leaned toward the phone. But you built the kind of table where men like him know what meal to serve. There was a long quiet. Then Richard said, Mrs. Brooks? Evelyn's eyebrows rose. So you remember me too. I remember Samuel bringing food to your house after your husband died. Then remember this. Samuel never let a person's worst day become a business opportunity. You might try that before you run out of years. Evan covered his mouth with one hand, but he did not interrupt. Richard said, I want the materials brought to the mansion tomorrow. We can review everything. Privately. Properly. Annie laughed once, softly and without humor. There's that word. What word? Privately. Annie, these matters are complicated. No, they are old. That is not the same. Leonard nodded across the table. Annie continued. You had private for 25 years. My father had private in a basement. The next room this truth enters will have witnesses. Richard's voice hardened slightly, the old authority trying to return. You don't understand what public exposure could do. To you? To the company? To people who work there? To my family? And what did private protection do to mine? Evan looked at his father's name glowing on the phone screen. Richard did not answer. Reverend Hayes leaned forward. His voice was calm, the kind used in hospital rooms and church basements after bad news. Mr. Whitmore, there will be a founders gala at your mansion tomorrow evening, will there not? Evan looked up sharply. How do you know that? Mrs. Alvarez said. It was in the paper. Big people do not hide parties. Only sins. Reverend Hayes continued. You are being honored for your company's history. That seems like a fitting place to correct it. Victor's distant voice suddenly returned, muffled but urgent. Richard, end this call. Richard must have opened the door again, or Victor had never gone far. Evan said, Dad, don't. Annie waited. For one moment she almost believed Richard might agree. Instead he said, No, not tomorrow. The words came controlled, but Annie heard the retreat. Evan's shoulders dropped. Richard continued, I need time. Annie looked at the tape, the papers, the debt note. My father gave you time. Annie, he gave you 25 years. I said I need time, and I said you already spent his. She reached over and ended the call before Richard could answer. Evan looked at her, startled. Why did you do that? Because I know a door closing when I hear one. He was talking. He was backing away. Evan sat slowly. The gala is tomorrow. Evelyn looked at Reverend Hayes. Can we get in? Evan answered. I can get you in. Leonard tapped the table. Not enough. If Victor controls the room, he controls the story before a word is said. Mrs. Alvarez lifted a finger. Caterers. Everyone turned to her. My niece works events. Big houses, hotels, charity dinners. Staff entrances are easier than front doors. Evelyn smiled. Now that is practical. Annie shook her head. I'm not sneaking into that house dressed like help so they can prove what they already think I am. Mrs. Alvarez touched her arm. No, mija. You go through the front if you can. But truth uses every door available. Evan straightened. I'll put Annie on the guest list. Victor will remove her, Leonard said. I'll put her under my name. Evelyn leaned back. The sun becomes the invitation. Annie looked at Evan. Are you sure? No, he said, but I'm doing it. Reverend Hayes gathered the documents into careful stacks. Then we prepare. Copies of the tape, copies of the note, copies of the shop registration, witness statements, not speeches, facts with a spine. Leonard pointed to the tape. I'll make 3 copies tonight. I'll write what I remember, Evelyn said. Not hearsay. What I saw, what Samuel told me directly. Mrs. Alvarez and Mr. Donnelly agreed to do the same. Reverend Hayes offered the church office copier and his notary contact. The kitchen began to move around Annie, not chaotically, but with purpose. Plates shifted, papers stacked, names written, numbers called, ordinary people doing ordinary things for a truth that had been left alone too long. Evan stayed at the table, looking at the archive box. Annie sat beside him. You can still leave. He shook his head. No, tomorrow will hurt your father. It already hurts. He looked at her. But I think not knowing what kind of man raised me hurts worse. Annie did not comfort him. Some pain had to do its work. Near midnight, Leonard left with the tape hidden inside an empty coffee tin. Reverend Hayes took copies of the papers under his raincoat. Mrs. Alvarez carried the food containers home and promised to return before noon. Evan left last. At the door, he turned back to Annie. My father may stop us. He can try. He's powerful. So was his silence, Annie said, and we found a key. After he left, Evelyn locked the door and put a chair beneath the knob, not because she expected trouble, but because old women trusted habit more than hope. Annie lay on the couch with the tin box beside her. She did not sleep right away. Tomorrow, the mansion would fill with donors, executives, polished shoes, soft music, and speeches about legacy. Richard Whitmore would stand in front of people who had applauded the version of him that erased Samuel Carter. This time, Annie would not come to the gate alone. And this time, if Richard refused to take the debt, the whole room would see him leave it in her hands. By noon the next day, Evelyn's kitchen had the tired look of a place that had done more work than most offices. Copies lay in labeled stacks across the table. Leonard's 3 cassette copies sat inside paper sleeves. Reverend Hayes had brought notarized statements from himself, Evelyn, Mrs. Alvarez, and Mr. Donnelly. Evan had sent a text confirming Annie's name was on the guest list as his personal guest, though none of them trusted that to hold. Annie stood at the sink washing a mug that was already clean. Evelyn let her do it for almost a minute before taking it from her hands. You'll scrub the flowers off that thing. I need to do something. You did. Now you need to get dressed. Annie looked down at her jeans and her father's old coat hanging over the chair. I am dressed. Evelyn gave her the kind of look that had corrected generations. You are dressed for the bus. Tonight you are walking into a room full of people who think silk means character. We are not dressing for them, but we are not handing them an easy excuse either. Mrs. Alvarez arrived with a garment bag over one arm. My niece had this from a catering job that got canceled. Simple black dress. Nothing flashy. Annie stiffened. I'm not wearing charity. It's not charity, Mrs. Alvarez said. It's strategy with a zipper. Evelyn nodded. Take the dress. Annie wanted to refuse because refusal felt like control. But control had not kept the landlord's notice off her door, or Richard's name out of her father's box. She took the garment bag and went into Evelyn's bedroom. The dress fit well enough, plain, knee-length, with sleeves that covered her shoulders. Evelyn gave her a pair of low black shoes and a dark wool coat. Annie kept her father's flannel folded inside her bag around the diary. The debt note stayed in an inside pocket. The photograph went into a stiff envelope. The copy of the speech draft and the transcript of Richard's tape were tucked beside it. When Annie came out, the kitchen went quiet. Evelyn's eyes softened first. "Your father would say you look like trouble with manners." Annie looked away. "He would tell me to check the bus schedule." Leonard cleared his throat. "Both can be true." Evan arrived at 3 in a gray sedan, not the sleek car from the day before. He said he had borrowed it from a friend so Victor's people would not recognize it too fast. Evelyn approved of that with a short nod. Finally, she said, "Money learning modesty." Evan opened the back door for her. "I can open a door," Evelyn said. "Yes, ma'am. I'm learning when not to argue." They drove toward Whitmore Estate as the sky lowered into evening. Annie sat in the front passenger seat with the tin box at her feet and her bag in her lap. Evan kept both hands on the wheel. In the back, Evelyn and Leonard held the copied documents between them like church fans on a hot Sunday. Reverend Hayes would arrive separately with Mrs. Alvarez and Mr. Donnelly. Marcus Hill had sent word through Evan that the staff entrance would not be blocked if things went wrong at the front. Annie did not like needing back doors, but she had learned not to despise any door that opened. Evan slowed when the mansion road came into view. "You okay?" he asked. "No." He nodded. "Me neither. That helps less than you think." "I know." The iron gates were lit from below, making them look taller than they were. A valet stand had been set near the drive. Cars moved ahead of them, expensive and quiet. Women stepped out holding small purses. Men adjusted cuffs and laughed with the ease of people entering rooms built to welcome them. At the gate, a guard checked Evan's name, then looked at Annie. "She's with me," Evan said. The guard looked at a tablet. His thumb moved once. Mr. Sloan requested all additional guests be confirmed directly with him. Evan's jaw tightened. "I confirmed her." "Yes, sir, but Mr. Sloan..." Evelyn leaned forward from the back seat. "Young man, is Mr. Sloan your father?" The guard blinked. "No, ma'am." "Then let the son take his guest to his own house." The guard hesitated, then waved them through. Evan murmured, "Thank you." Evelyn settled back. People mistake age for decoration. Useful mistake. The mansion was brighter than Annie remembered. Music drifted from inside, soft piano under the sound of conversation. White tents had been set near the side lawn. Staff moved with trays. A banner near the front steps read, "Whitmore Global Founders Gala, honoring a legacy of vision." Annie read the word legacy and felt her hand close around the strap of her bag. Inside, the foyer had been turned into a receiving line. Richard stood near the base of the staircase greeting guests, a practiced smile on his face. Clara Whitmore stood beside him, elegant in a dark green dress, looking less practiced and more watchful. Victor hovered near a side hall with a phone in one hand. Richard saw Annie before Victor did. The smile left him. Evan stepped forward. "She's my guest." Richard's eyes moved to the tin box in Annie's hand. "I see that." Victor came over quickly. "Evan, this is not appropriate." Clara looked at Annie. "You're Annie Carter." "Yes." Clara held out her hand. "I'm Clara." Annie shook it. Clara's hand was cool, her grip careful but sincere. "I read the guest note Evan sent me," Clara said. "He didn't say much, but he said enough to make me look through our family website. There's no Samuel Carter anywhere." "No," Annie said. "There wouldn't be." Victor lowered his voice. "Miss Carter, this evening is a charitable and corporate event. If you attempt to disrupt it, you will be removed." Evelyn stepped beside Annie. "You keep promising to remove people. Does your profession offer any other service?" Clara's eyes flicked to Evelyn with something close to respect. Richard spoke before Victor could answer. "Annie, we need to talk privately." "No," Annie said. His mouth tightened. "Not here." "Yes," she said. "That is exactly the problem. It was never here. It was always somewhere private. A basement, a bay, a cabinet, a tape no one played." Clara turned to her father. "Dad." "What tape?" Victor said. "Clara." "Not now." Clara did not look at him. "I asked my father." Richard took a slow breath. "There are matters from the early company years that need review," Annie said. "That's the cleanest dirty sentence I've heard all week." A guest nearby turned at the sound of her voice. then another. Richard noticed. So did Victor. Evan stepped closer to Annie. Not in front of her this time, just beside her. Dad, you said Samuel's name last night. Say it now. Richard's face hardened. Evan, say it. The air around the receiving line changed. A woman with pearls stopped mid-conversation. A man holding a glass of wine looked from Richard to Evan. Victor smiled tightly at the guests. Family matter. Annie looked at him. No. That is what you call it when a man's public story has a private victim. Clara's voice came quietly. Who was Samuel Carter? Richard looked at his daughter. For a moment, Annie saw the same fear she had seen in him with Evan, only sharper now. It was one thing for a son to challenge him at a gate. It was another for a daughter to ask in a room full of people who had come to praise him. Before Richard could answer, a man in a tuxedo approached with a broad smile. Richard, they're ready for you in the ballroom. Board wants remarks before dinner. Victor seized the chance. Perfect. We're moving to the program. Annie reached into her bag and touched the cassette copy. Leonard had brought a small recorder in his coat pocket. Absurdly old and completely necessary. Evelyn whispered, Not yet. Annie nodded. A truth released too early could be called a scene. A truth released at the wrong moment could be buried under confusion. They needed Richard at the microphone, under his own banner, in front of the people who had applauded the story. Richard seemed to understand that too. His eyes moved from Annie to Leonard's coat, then to the tin box. Annie, he said, low enough that only those near him could hear. Do not do this tonight. She looked at him. Then you do it. Victor's lips tightened. Enough. No, Clara said. Everyone turned. She looked at her father. If there is something true, don't make strangers say it for you. Richard's face shifted with pain, but pain was not action. The ballroom doors opened. Applause began before Richard even entered. It rolled out warm and easy, the sound of people welcoming the man they thought they knew. Evan looked at Annie. Ready? Annie thought of Samuel's stopped watch. 2:17. The hour one man paid and another man promised. She thought of the note, the photo, the diary, the line on Richard's tape. The story is cleaner without him. No, she said, but I'm done waiting. They walked into the ballroom behind Richard Whitmore. The room was filled with round tables, white linens, tall flowers, and donors wearing smiles polished for public use. On the stage, beneath a gold-lit company logo, a podium waited. Richard climbed the steps slowly. Victor stood near the side wall, already signaling someone on staff. Clara moved to the front row with Evan. Evelyn, Leonard, and Annie took seats near the aisle. The tin box rested at Annie's feet. Richard placed his prepared speech on the podium. He looked out over the ballroom. Then he looked at Annie. For a second, she thought he might fold the speech and tell the truth. Instead, he began, Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering to honor a legacy that began with one man, one rented repair bay, and a belief that hard work could build something lasting. Annie felt Evelyn's hand close over hers. Leonard reached inside his coat for the recorder, and Annie knew the clean story had just told its first lie of the night. Richard's voice carried through the ballroom with the ease of long practice. He knew where to pause, when to soften a word, how to make success sound humble without giving anything away. People often ask me what it took to build Whitmore Global, he said. They expect me to say capital, timing, or strategy. But the truth is simpler. It took discipline. It took sacrifice. It took the willingness to keep working when no one believed the work mattered. Annie sat still, but her hands had gone cold. Evelyn leaned close. Breathe. I am. No, you're holding fire in your chest and calling it air. On stage, Richard looked down at his speech. The paper in front of him was thick and cream-colored. Nothing like the wrinkled debt note in Annie's coat. He had chosen every word to make himself clean. Leonard's hand remained inside his coat, resting on the recorder, but he did not move yet. Richard continued, I began in a rented repair bay with little more than a toolbox and a stubborn belief in the future. There were nights I slept beside machines because I could not afford to lose a single hour. Those early years taught me that legacy is not inherited. It is built. Evan stood from the front row. The motion was small, but Clara saw it. So did Victor. Richard paused for half a second. then kept going. And tonight, as I look around this room, I am grateful for everyone who has helped carry that legacy forward. Evan said, "Dad." His voice was not loud, but the first few tables heard it. Heads turned. Richard kept his hands on the podium. "Evan, please sit down." Evan did not. Victor moved along the wall, signaling to a staff member near the sound booth. Clara rose too. "Let him ask." The murmurs spread faster now. A board member near the stage leaned toward his wife. A woman in pearls lowered her wine glass. Someone at the back whispered, "What's happening?" Evan looked up at his father. Was Samuel Carter part of that rented repair bay? The name entered the ballroom like a chair dragged across polished wood. Richard's face tightened. "This is not the time." Annie stood. Evelyn stood with her. Leonard stood on Annie's other side. Richard looked at them, and the room followed his eyes. For the first time, many of the guests noticed Annie not as a server, not as a guest beside Evan, but as the reason the speech had cracked. Victor reached them first. "Sit down, all of you." Evelyn did not even turn her head. "I sat down for 72 years. When men like you said later, my knees are done with that." Victor lowered his voice. "You are disrupting a private event." Annie looked at the stage. "So was erasing my father, but you dressed that up as history." Now the room heard her. Richard said, "Annie." "No," she said. "You started with one man in a rented repair bay. Say the other man's name." A board member rose. "Richard, do you need security?" Clara turned toward him. "Nobody needs security. We need honesty." Victor's jaw tightened. "Clara, you do not understand the implications. I understand my father is being asked a simple question, and everyone with money in the room is terrified of the answer." That silenced more people than Annie expected. Richard gripped the sides of the podium. "Samuel Carter worked with me briefly in the early years." Annie almost laughed. "Briefly. Worked with me." Even now he was trying to carry a body through a narrow door without letting the feet show. Leonard stepped forward into the aisle. Samuel Carter held the trade license on Carter and Whitmore Repair Company. Several guests turned fully now. Richard's eyes moved to Leonard. "Leonard, so you remember me too," Leonard said. "Good. Saves time." Victor pointed toward the exit. "This man is not on the program." "No," Evelyn said. "The truth rarely is." Annie reached into her bag and took out the copy of the shop registration. She did not wave it. She held it carefully, the way her father would have wanted. "This is the county registration," she said. "Carter and Whitmore Repair Company. Samuel Carter and Richard Whitmore." My father's name was not brief. It was first. A man near the stage asked, "Is this verified?" Leonard answered, "Copied from county records and supported by witness statement. Mine." Victor said, "These documents have not been authenticated." Reverend Hayes rose from a table near the back. "Some have been notarized this afternoon." Victor turned toward him, startled. "Who are you?" "Reverend Thomas Hayes. I maintain better records than most companies, and worse coffee than most diners." A nervous laugh moved through part of the room and died quickly. Richard looked smaller behind the podium now, though he had not moved. Annie did not enjoy it. That surprised her. She wanted truth, not theater. But Richard had made a stage of his life. Now the truth had climbed onto it with him. Evan said, "Dad, tell them about the 42,000. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Victor moved toward the stage. "Richard, do not answer." The microphone caught Richard's breath. Annie stepped into the aisle. "My father paid a debt that was not his, $42,000. He sold his truck, damaged his name, and kept a broken watch, stopped at 2:17. Because that was the hour the bank stamped the payment." The ballroom changed again. Not everyone believed her. Annie could see that. Some faces were defensive, some curious, some irritated that an expensive dinner had turned into something they could not control, but others listened with the sober attention older people give when they recognize the smell of a life being misrepresented. Leonard held up the copy of the bank receipt. Bank stamp, settlement record, debt note, signed by Richard Whitmore. Victor said, "Enough. This is defamatory." Then Leonard took the recorder from his coat. Victor saw it and went still. Richard saw it too. Annie looked at Richard. "You can still say it yourself." The room waited. Richard's throat moved, but no words came. Annie nodded once to Leonard. He pressed play. The old machine clicked. For a second there was only hiss, thin and strange beneath the chandeliers. Then Richard's younger voice came through the small speaker. Not loud, but the microphone on the podium caught enough of it to carry. "I should mention Sam. I know I should. Without Samuel Carter, there would be no first bay, no first contract, no second chance after the warehouse. But the story is cleaner without him. God forgive me, it is cleaner." A sound moved through the ballroom. Not a gasp exactly. More like air, leaving people at different speeds. Richard's hands fell from the podium. The tape went on. "Maybe one day I'll fix it." Leonard stopped the recorder. No one clapped. No one spoke. Victor's face had gone pale with anger. That recording was obtained without authorization from private archives. Evelyn looked at him. Notice he didn't say it was false. Clara turned toward Richard. Her voice shook, but she did not hide it. "Dad." Richard looked at her, then at Evan, then at Annie. Whatever speech he had prepared was gone now. It sat on the podium like an object from a different room. Annie walked closer to the stage but did not climb it. She took the yellow debt note from her coat and held it up. "I came to return this," she said. He refused it at the gate. Maybe because taking it meant admitting my father carried what he should have carried himself. Richard's voice was rough. "Annie, don't say my name softer than you said his." That struck him. She saw it. "Say Samuel Carter," she said. He looked at the room, and for the first time there was no private corner left for him. "Samuel Carter," Richard said. The microphone carried it. Annie felt Evelyn's hand find her back, steady and warm. Richard continued, each word pulled from somewhere he had kept locked. "Samuel Carter was not a brief employee. He was my partner. He was the skilled man in the first shop. He held the license. He warned me when I cut corners. He paid a debt that should have destroyed me. And I let the world call me self-made because it was easier than admitting I had been saved by the man I betrayed." The ballroom stayed silent. Victor stepped toward the podium. "Richard, stop." Richard turned to him. "No, think about what you are doing." "I am. You are exposing yourself, the company, your family." Richard's voice sharpened. "My family is already exposed. They have been living under a roof built with a missing name." Victor looked at the board members, hoping one of them would help. None moved quickly enough. Annie did not relax. Confession could still become performance. She had seen men apologize when trapped, and call that courage. Richard looked back at her. "Where is Samuel buried?" The question cut through her guard. Annie answered after a moment. "Mount Calvary, Section D. No stone yet. I couldn't afford one." Richard's face changed in a way the room could not polish. He put one hand on the podium, but not like a speaker now. Like a man keeping himself standing. Evan covered his eyes. Clara looked down. Evelyn whispered, "Lord." Richard tried to speak. Failed once. Then said, "I have my name on buildings." Annie said nothing. "My name is on a hospital wing," he continued. "A business school lecture hall. A foundation. Samuel Carter doesn't have a stone." The room had no answer for him. It should not have. Some facts do not need help being shameful. Richard stepped away from the podium. Victor reached for his arm. Richard pulled free. Then, in front of the donors, board members, reporters, his children, the neighbors who remembered Samuel, and the young woman who carried his debt note, Richard Whitmore came down from the stage. He stopped in front of Annie. "I cannot take back what I did," he said. "No," Annie answered. "You can't. I cannot pay him back." "No." His eyes filled, but Annie did not move to comfort him. Richard looked at the yellowed paper in her hand. "May I take it now?" The room waited with him. Annie held the debt note for a long moment. Then she placed it in his hand. Richard's fingers closed around the paper as if it weighed more than any award he had ever held. He lowered his head. Not a bow for the room, not yet the full breaking that would come later. But the first public bend in a man who had spent his life standing on another man's sacrifice. Annie said quietly, "Now you can start telling the rest." Richard stood in the center aisle with the debt note in his hand, and every face in the ballroom turned toward him. The paper trembled once, then stilled. Annie noticed because she had spent years watching hands. Her father's hands when pain moved through his joints, the landlord's hands when he folded notices, Victor Sloane's hands when he tried to make threats look like paperwork. Richard's hands were different now. They belonged to a man holding the part of his life he had not paid for. Victor recovered first. He always did. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, stepping into the aisle with a measured smile, "I apologize for this interruption. Mr. Whitmore has clearly been placed under emotional strain by unsupported materials brought into a private event. We will pause the program and continue after." "No," Richard said. Victor turned. "Richard, not another word." Richard looked at him, and something in that look made Victor stop. "For 25 years, Richard said, you and men like you told me not another word." The microphone still caught him because he was close enough to the stage. His voice carried, not smooth now, not practiced. Guests shifted in their seats. Someone near the back raised a phone, then lowered it when Clara turned and gave the person a look sharp enough to remind them this was not entertainment. Richard lifted the yellowed paper. "This is my signature." Annie felt Evelyn's hand press lightly against her arm. Richard looked at the debt note, not the room. "This is Samuel Carter's signature, and this is the debt I promised to repay after he saved me from the consequences of my own choices." A board member stood. "Richard, we should adjourn to discuss this responsibly." Richard's mouth tightened. Responsibly would have been 25 years ago. Victor came closer. "This is exposure without preparation," Leonard said from the aisle. "Truth usually is." A few older guests nodded before they seemed to realize they had done it. Richard turned toward the ballroom. The first version of Whitmore did not begin with one man. It began with Samuel Carter and me in a rented repair bay on the east side. He held the trade license. He had the hands. I had ambition and a talent for making promises. Some were useful, some were lies. Evan stood at the front, his face pale. Clara reached for his hand, without looking away from their father. Richard continued. "Samuel warned me about a contract. I ignored him. Men were hurt because I cared more about speed and profit than judgment. When the bank called the note and the contractor threatened legal action, Samuel paid $42,000 he did not owe. He sold his truck. He signed papers that made him look responsible for things he had tried to prevent. He did it because he remembered a friend I had already begun to outgrow." Annie closed her eyes for 1 second. There it was. Not all of it, but enough for the room to stop pretending they had witnessed a misunderstanding. A woman at a front table whispered, "My God." Victor heard the shift. "Richard, any further statements should be made under advisement." Richard turned on him. "Did you know about the later statement?" Victor's face set. Richard repeated louder, "Did you know about the document asking Samuel Carter to reduce himself to contract labor?" Victor chose his words with care. "I was made aware of historical cleanup language during restructuring." "Historical cleanup," Evelyn said. "Listen to that. Like a man's name was dust on a shelf." Richard looked ill. "Did you send it?" Victor did not answer. Clara stepped forward. "Answer him." Victor looked at her, then at Richard. "I protected the company." "No," Annie said. Her voice was not loud, but the room heard it. "You protected the lie the company liked best." Victor's eyes moved to her. "You are 18 years old. You have no understanding of corporate liability, shareholder duty, or the damage that reckless allegations can create." Annie held his gaze. "I understand a man died without a headstone while your client's name was carved into buildings. I understand that just fine." Evelyn murmured, "That'll preach." Richard looked at Annie, then back at Victor. "You're dismissed." Victor went still. "Excuse me? You no longer speak for me tonight." "Richard, you cannot make that decision in this condition." "This condition," Richard said, "is the first honest one I've had in years." Victor's face tightened. For a moment Annie thought he might keep arguing, but a fired man in front of donors had less power than a whispered lawyer in a hallway. He stepped back, his mouth set in a line that promised this was not finished. Richard turned to Evan. "There's a lower archive in the library." Evan nodded. "I brought the first box. There are more." Richard's voice strained. "Behind the east cabinet. Samuel's name is on one." Annie felt the room tilt. Not physically, but in meaning. Another box. More proof. More years of Richard keeping what he had publicly denied. Evan looked hurt all over again. "You kept his file?" "Yes." "Why?" Richard held the debt note between both hands. because throwing it away would have made me worse than I already was. Keeping it let me pretend I might still become better. Clara's voice broke slightly. And did you? Richard turned toward her. No. That single word quieted the room more than any confession before it. Annie expected to feel satisfaction. Instead, she felt tired. Not weak, just tired in the way a person gets when a truth finally reaches daylight and shows how long it had been carrying itself alone. Richard looked at the tables, the flowers, the banner honoring his legacy. Dinner is canceled. A ripple moved through the room. He raised his hand before anyone could object. The gala is not. If you came to celebrate the history of this company, you will hear the history. If you came to donate, you will be given a different place to put your money before you leave. If you came only for the version of me that made you comfortable, you may go. No one moved at first. Then an older man near the back stood. He wore a dark suit that had seen better years and held his hat in both hands. I knew Sam Carter, he said. Annie turned. The man cleared his throat. Name's Wallace Green. I hauled parts out of Ashland Yard back then. Sam fixed a pump for me when I couldn't pay. Said I could bring him catfish when the season turned. Never did get him that fish. A quiet laugh moved through the room, sad and warm. Another voice came from a side table. My husband worked a warehouse job connected to that failure. A woman in her 60s rose slowly. He came home with a shoulder that never healed right. We were told Samuel Carter had signed off on the equipment. He carried that anger for years. Richard's face folded with pain. What was your husband's name? Daniel Reeves. Richard looked down. I remember. No, the woman said. You remember now. The words struck clean. Annie watched the woman sit. The story was spreading beyond Samuel, beyond her family. Richard's choices had made shadows in other houses too. Reverend Hayes stepped into the aisle. Mr. Whitmore, if you mean to tell the history, you should begin with the record, not remorse. Remorse can still flatter a man if he is not careful. Richard nodded slowly. You're right. He looked at Annie. Will you allow Leonard to read Samuel's letter? Annie did not answer at once. The letter was not Richard's to use for redemption. It was Samuel's final word to a man who had failed him. She turned to Leonard. Read it. But not for him, Leonard understood. He took the copied letter from his folder and moved to the microphone. Richard stepped away from the podium and stood to the side, holding the debt note like a sentence he had not finished serving. Leonard adjusted his glasses. Samuel wrote this for Richard, but I believe he also wrote it for the day when the rest of us stopped letting rich men decide which poor men deserved a record. He read the letter from Bay 3. The ballroom listened. Even the servers near the wall stopped moving. When Leonard reached the line, I did not pay it because you were innocent. I paid it because I could not let the worst thing you did be the end of you. Evan lowered his head. Clara wiped her cheek with the heel of her hand. Richard did not cry then, Annie noticed. He looked past crying, into some place where crying would come later when there was no room left to perform it. When Leonard finished, there was no applause. Applause would have been wrong. Instead, people sat with the words, and the silence became a kind of respect. Richard returned to the microphone. Tomorrow morning, he said, Whitmore Global will release a corrected founding history, naming Samuel Carter as co-founder of the original repair company. Tonight, I am directing the board to establish an independent review of the warehouse failure, the debt, the restructuring documents, and the later removal of Mr. Carter's name. A board member started to object, then saw the room and stayed quiet. Richard continued, I will place $10 million into a fund in Samuel Carter's name. Annie's head snapped up. No, she said. The room turned toward her. Richard looked confused. Annie, no, she repeated. You do not get to put his name on your guilt and call the amount generous. Evelyn's eyes flashed with approval. Richard lowered his voice. Then tell me what is right. Annie walked toward the stage, stopping a few feet from him. A fund is not wrong, but it will not be a Whitmore apology dressed in my father's work shirt. It will serve workers who get blamed when companies cut corners. It will support families who cannot afford lawyers when men with offices call harm complicated. It will help young people learn trades without having to sell their future to survive. And my father's name will not be under yours. Richard nodded slowly. Agreed. Victor, from the side wall, looked as if every word cost him money. Annie continued. And before any building, any fund, any press release, my father gets a headstone. Richard's face changed. A real one, Annie said. Not because he was your mistake, because he was Samuel Carter. Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. Yes. Evan stepped beside his father. I'll go with you. Richard looked at him. To the cemetery, Evan said. Not for cameras. Clara joined them. Me too. Annie did not say thank you. This was not kindness. This was overdue. Mrs. Alvarez stood near the back. And maybe someone should feed people before they leave. Hard truth on an empty stomach makes folks mean. A few soft laughs broke the tension. Evelyn nodded. Finally, somebody practical. The room began to move, not back to celebration, but into something stranger and more human. Guests spoke in low voices. Some left. Some stayed. A few approached Annie. But Evelyn positioned herself like a gate of her own, and allowed only those who spoke with respect. Wallace Green came over, hat in hand. You, Samuel's girl? Yes, sir. He was a good man. I know. No, Wallace said gently. You know as his daughter. Tonight you'll start knowing as the rest of us did. That undid her more than the speeches. Annie looked away, blinking hard. Across the room, Richard stood alone for a moment, with the debt note still in hand. Evan and Clara spoke nearby, but he seemed separated from everything by the years he had not answered for. Then he walked toward Annie. Evelyn stiffened, but Annie gave a small shake of her head. Richard stopped at a respectful distance. I need to show you the file. Tonight? Yes, before I lose courage and call it timing. She studied him. That sounded too honest to be polished. Leonard comes, she said. Evelyn too. Of course. And Evan and Clara. Richard glanced at his children. Yes. Annie looked at the debt note in his hand. You keep that for now. Richard looked surprised. Not as proof, she said. As weight. He nodded once. The ballroom had been built to honor Richard Whitmore. By the end of the night, it had become a room where his name no longer stood alone. But Annie knew the hardest part was not a public confession under pressure. The hardest part was what came after applause would have been convenient and silence would have been easier. As they left the ballroom for the lower library, Annie carried the tin box under one arm. Richard carried the debt note. Between them walked Evan and Clara, children of a man they were meeting for the first time. And somewhere in the old paper waiting behind the east cabinet, Samuel Carter's name had not finished speaking. The lower library sat beneath the west wing of the mansion, down a narrow staircase most guests would never notice. Richard led the way with the debt note still in his hand. The music from the ballroom faded behind them until it became only a low vibration through the walls. Annie followed with the tin box under one arm, Evelyn at her side, Leonard behind them, and Evan and Clara walking in silence. No one spoke until Richard unlocked the library door. The room smelled different from the rest of the mansion. Less flowers, less polish, more paper, leather, dust, and locked drawers. Shelves covered 3 walls. A long table stood in the center under a green-shaded lamp. Along the far wall was a cabinet built into the wood paneling, darker than the rest, with brass handles worn from use. Evelyn looked around. So this is where rich people keep what they don't want framed. Richard did not answer. He crossed to the cabinet, took a key from his pocket, then stopped with his hand near the lock. Clara spoke softly. Dad, he looked at her. Don't stop now. That did it. Richard opened the cabinet. Inside were rows of boxes, each labeled in his handwriting. Early contracts, founding press, warehouse, restructuring, legal, At the very bottom, set apart from the rest, was a narrow gray box with one word written across the front. Carter. Annie felt her grip tighten around the tin box. Her father's name looked strange in that cabinet. Too neat. Too contained. As if Richard had given Samuel a drawer after taking his place in the story. Richard lifted the box and carried it to the table. He did not open it. Annie set the tin box down opposite it, rusted metal across from gray archive board. A poor man's basement facing a rich man's library. Leonard looked at the 2 boxes and said, well, that about sums up America. Evelyn gave him a look. Don't get poetic. Open it. Richard touched the lid, but his fingers did not move. Annie watched him. "You said you wanted to show me." "I do." "Then do it." Richard drew a slow breath and opened the Carter file. The first thing inside was another photograph, not the one from the shop front. This one showed Samuel seated at a workbench, sleeves rolled, head bent over an engine part. Richard stood nearby with a clipboard. He was not smiling. He looked like a man learning from someone and trying not to admit it. Beneath the photograph were documents: the original bay lease, insurance forms, trade license copies, early invoices, a bank notice, a contractor complaint, the settlement summary, and a yellow legal pad covered in Richard's old handwriting. Annie reached for the license copy. Richard said, "Samuel's license made the shop possible." She looked at him. "Say it plain." Richard's throat moved. "Without Samuel, I could not have opened the first shop." Evan sat down hard in one of the chairs. Clara put one hand on the table. "Why did you never tell us?" Richard looked at the papers. "Because the first lie was easy. I told an interviewer I started in a rented repair bay. He called me self-made. I didn't correct him. Then another article repeated it. Then investors liked it. The company liked it. By the time I understood what I had done, telling the truth felt like burning down the house I had built." Evelyn's voice came flat. "So you let Samuel live in the ashes?" Richard closed his eyes for a second. "Yes." No one softened the word for him. Leonard took out his glasses and examined the settlement summary. "This confirms what I kept. Samuel's payment, Richard's liability exposure, warehouse failure. It names the injured workers, too." Annie looked up. "Who?" Leonard read from the page. "Daniel Reeves, Martin Cole, Alonzo Briggs." Richard said, "They were paid settlements later." Annie turned to him. "By you? By the company?" "That's not what I asked." Richard lowered his eyes. "No, not personally." Annie thought of the woman in the ballroom, Daniel Reeves's wife, saying her husband's shoulder had never healed right. One man's lie did not stay in one house. It traveled through bodies, paychecks, marriages, winters. Clara picked up a typed memo. Her face changed as she read. "What is this?" Richard did not look. Clara read aloud. "Samuel Carter's role should be described, if necessary, as informal support during pre-incorporation operations. Avoid partnership language. Victor's work," Annie thought, "or someone like him." Clara looked at her father. "You approve this?" Richard took the memo. His hand tightened around it. "I don't remember this exact draft." Evelyn snorted. "Convenient. But yes," Richard said. "I approve the direction." Evan leaned forward. "You didn't just forget him. You managed him out." Richard said nothing. Annie opened the tin box and removed her father's diary. She set it beside the Carter file. "He wrote about this. Not with your words. With pain." Richard looked at the diary but did not touch it. Annie opened to the marked page and read, "Richard did not come to the house after the bank stamped the payment. He sent flowers once, when my mother died. No note, just the Whitmore name on a card, as if a printed name could stand in for a man." Clara covered her mouth. Annie turned another page. "The paper says, I took responsibility. Let it say what it wants. I know what I tried to stop. God knows. Maybe one day Richard will know again." She closed the diary. Richard sat down slowly. The debt note lay in front of him now, next to the memo that erased Samuel and the license that proved him. The room had no applause, no guests, no stage, only documents and people close enough to hear his breathing change. Evan's voice was rough. "Dad, why keep all this?" Richard looked at the Carter box. "Because I wanted to believe there would be a day when I would fix it. But you didn't." "No." "Why?" Richard's eyes reddened. "Because every year made the truth more expensive." Annie said, "For you." Richard looked at her. "For you?" she repeated. "For my father, the lie got expensive the first day. That broke something more than the ballroom had." Richard lowered his head, both hands on the table. For a moment, Annie thought he might speak, but no words came. Evelyn did not let the room drift into pity. Crying over ledgers won't buy a stone. Richard lifted his face. "I know." "No," Evelyn said. "You know tonight. Knowing tomorrow is the test, Leonard sorted the documents into 3 piles: originals, copies, and items needing independent verification. I'll prepare an index. Reverend Hayes can help with witness statements. You'll need outside counsel, not Victor. Richard nodded. Victor is finished. Men like that are never finished, Evelyn said. They become phone calls. Clara looked at Annie. What do you want done first? Annie answered without hesitation. My father's headstone. Then a public correction. Not a press release full of soft words. His name on the company history. The shop. The license. The debt. All of it. Richard nodded. And the injured workers, Annie said. Their families get contacted. Not by Victor. Not by someone asking them to sign anything. By someone ready to listen. Clara wrote it down on a notepad. Evan watched her, then took out his phone and began making his own list. Richard looked at his children. Shame crossed his face again. But this time Annie saw something else under it. The beginning of usefulness. Then Richard reached into the Carter box and removed a small envelope Annie had not seen. It was sealed, though the glue had dried loose with age. On the front was written Annie. Her breath stopped. Richard held it out. Samuel gave this to me. Annie did not take it. When? The last time I saw him. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. You saw Samuel after all that? Richard nodded. Years later, he came to the lobby of my office. I would not bring him upstairs. The sentence sat in the room like a stain. Annie's voice was quiet. Why? Because there were people with me. Investors. A reporter. I told myself it was not the time. Leonard said, Lord save us from men and their timing. Richard looked at the envelope. He handed this to me and said, if I ever found the courage to make things right, I should start with his daughter. I put it in the file. I never opened it. Annie took the envelope then, because leaving it in his hand felt wrong. Her name was written in her father's hand, Annie. No last name, no explanation. Just Annie. As if he had believed she would find her way to it. She opened it carefully. Inside was one folded page. My Annie, if this letter ever reaches you through Richard Whitmore, then it means the truth found a harder road than I hoped. I am sorry for that. I wanted to leave you a life without bitterness, but I may have left you questions instead. Do not let what I carried teach you to carry every burden placed near you. Kindness without boundaries becomes another man's ladder. Remember that. I loved Richard once like a brother. That was real. His betrayal was real too. Both things can be true, and you do not have to make one smaller to survive the other. If he is standing before you with this letter, make him speak plain. Make him pay what money can pay, and make him return what money cannot buy. Your daddy. Annie read the last 2 words twice. Your daddy. The room blurred. Evelyn moved beside her, but did not touch her until Annie leaned toward her. Then the old woman put an arm around her shoulders and held her the way people hold the living when the dead have reached too far back into the room. Richard stood. Annie, he said. She looked at him through tears she had fought too long to keep back. I am sorry, he said. The words were too small. They both knew it. Annie wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. Say what you did. Richard's face twisted. Not sorry, she said. Plain. Richard stepped around the table. No one moved to stop him, but no one made space easy either. He came to Annie slowly, holding the debt note in one hand and Samuel's file in the other. I let your father pay my debt, he said. I let him lose his truck, his license, and his place in the company story. I let people believe I built alone. I kept proof of him while denying him. I let him come to my office and turned him away. I kept a letter meant for you in a box because opening it would have required me to become the man he hoped I still could be. Annie's breath shook. Richard's knees bent before he seemed to decide to bend them. He lowered himself to the floor in front of her. Not in the ballroom. Not under cameras. Not where applause could rescue him. In the lower library, between the tin box and the Carter file. The billionaire knelt before the 18-year-old daughter of the man he had erased. Evan whispered, Dad. Richard did not look at him. His eyes stayed on Annie. I left him, he said. And now the tears came without dignity to protect them. God help me. I left the best friend I ever had. Annie did not step back. She did not tell him to rise. She did not forgive him because the room wanted a clean ending. She held her father's letter in one hand and looked down at the man who had finally reached the level of the truth. My father told me to make you return what money cannot buy, she said. Richard nodded, crying silently now. So start with his name. I will. No, Annie said. Start now. Richard bowed his head. Samuel Carter, he said. Founder. Mechanic. Partner. The man who saved me when I did not deserve saving. The words filled the lower library without a microphone. Annie closed her eyes. For the first time since she found the tin box, her father's name did not feel buried. It felt present. Richard stayed on his knees longer than anyone expected. No one told him to get up. Annie did not move either. The lower library held its breath around them. The rich man kneeling. The tin box open. The Carter file spread across the table. And Samuel's letter trembling slightly in Annie's hand. At last Evelyn spoke, not harshly, but with the weight of someone who had seen too many apologies spend themselves before breakfast. Mr. Whitmore, grief can bend a man. It does not rebuild what he broke. Richard lifted his head. His face was wet. His suit creased at the knees. I understand. No, Evelyn said. You are beginning to. Annie folded her father's letter and placed it inside the tin box, not with the old papers, but on top of them. Then she closed the lid. The sound was small, but it brought Richard to his feet. Evan helped him up, though Richard looked ashamed to need the hand. Clara stood beside the table, one palm resting on the Carter file as if she feared it might disappear. Leonard cleared his throat. First thing is copies. Every document in that box. Tonight. Richard nodded. Use the office copier. No, Annie said. He turned to her. Not your office, not your staff, not one machine Victor ever touched. Leonard gave a pleased nod. I know a print shop opened late near Charles Street. Richard accepted it. Then we go there. Evan looked at his father. All of us? All of us, Richard said. That was the first useful sentence Annie had heard from him. They left the lower library by the back stairs, avoiding the ballroom, where guests were still murmuring over coffee and half-eaten plates. Victor stood near the foyer with two board members, speaking low and fast. When he saw Richard carrying the Carter file, his expression changed. Richard, he said, stepping forward, you need to stop before you create irreversible exposure. Richard did not slow. I created that years ago. This is not courage. This is panic. Annie turned. No, Mr. Sloan. Panic is what you did when a dead man's name walked into the room. Victor's eyes narrowed. You have no idea what you are setting in motion. Evelyn adjusted her purse on her arm. Good. Then it'll be a surprise for all of us. Clara stepped between Victor and the group. You're done here. I represent this family. No, Clara said. You represented the version of it that kept me ignorant. Victor looked at Richard, waiting for rescue. Richard gave him none. That silence, Annie thought, was different from the old kind. This one did not hide Samuel. It let Victor stand alone. They copied the documents that night at a small print shop whose owner knew Leonard and did not ask questions beyond how many sets they needed. Richard paid in cash. Leonard watched every page come through the machine. Annie kept the originals within reach. Evan labeled folders. Clara made a list of injured workers' families and company records to request. Evelyn sat in a plastic chair near the door, like a guard with sensible shoes. At 2 a.m, they drove to Mount Calvary Cemetery. Annie had not planned it. Richard asked if he could see the place, and she almost refused. Then she thought of her father's letter. Make him return what money cannot buy. A man could not return honor to a grave he was too afraid to visit. The cemetery gate was closed, so they stood outside it in the cold. Annie pointed through the iron bars toward a dark section beyond the trees. He's there, she said. Section D, temporary marker. The funeral home placed it. It leans when it rains. Richard gripped the folder under his arm. Tomorrow, I'll arrange. No, Annie said. Tomorrow, we will arrange. You will pay. He nodded. Yes. And it won't say anything about you. No. It won't say beloved friend of Richard Whitmore. Richard's face tightened with pain. No, it will say who he was. Clara took out her phone and typed as Annie spoke. Samuel Carter. Annie said. Mechanic. Founder. Father. A man who carried another man's debt but never lost his own name. Evelyn wiped one eye and blamed the cold. By morning, the city already knew something had happened at the Whitmore Gala. A business reporter had posted a short piece before dawn. By noon, the company released Richard's full statement, not the clean version Victor would have written. It named Samuel Carter as co-founder of Carter and Whitmore Repair Company. It described the debt, the warehouse failure, the settlement, the erased history, and the documents now turned over to independent counsel. It also announced an outside review for the injured workers and their families. Some people praised Richard too quickly. Annie hated that. Evelyn did too. America loves a rich man's second act, Evelyn said at her kitchen table, reading the paper. Even when a poor man paid for the first one, Annie looked at the headline. Whitmore Admit's co-founder was erased from company history. Under it was a photograph of Richard from the gala, looking broken and older. There was no picture of Samuel. Not enough, Annie said. No, Evelyn agreed. But it's no longer nothing. The headstone came first. Richard did not send an assistant. He came with Evan and Clara, wearing a plain dark coat, and stood with Annie, Evelyn, Leonard, Reverend Hayes, Mrs. Alvarez, Mr. Donnelly, and half the block Samuel had helped one repair at a time. The stone was gray, simple, and solid. Annie ran her fingers over the carved letters. Samuel Carter, mechanic, founder, father, a man who carried another man's debt but never lost his own name. Richard stood a few feet away, hands folded in front of him. Reverend Hayes said a prayer, then spoke not of wealth or scandal, but of repair. There are machines that fail because someone ignored the warning sound. There are families and companies that fail the same way, but repair begins when the noise is finally heard. Leonard placed the broken watch at the base of the stone, then looked at Annie. You sure? Annie picked it up again after a moment. No. This comes with me. Daddy kept the time. I'll keep the reminder. Richard stepped forward. Annie, she looked at him. The fund papers are ready for review. I named it the Samuel Carter Trade and Justice Fund. As you asked. Independent board. Worker safety grants. Legal aid for injured laborers. Trade training. Scholarships. No Whitmore name on the title. Who chairs it? You do if you want. Annie almost laughed. I'm 18. You are also the reason it exists. Evelyn leaned close. Don't answer from fear, baby girl. Answer from fit. Annie looked at the stone, then at the people gathered around it. I won't chair it alone. Leonard, Reverend Hayes, and one of the injured workers' family members sit on the board. Clara, too. Clara looked surprised. Me? You need to learn what your family story costs when it leaves the house. Clara nodded. I will. Richard said. Agreed. Months passed, though none of it felt simple. Lawyers argued. Reporters called. Victor tried to challenge the release of certain documents, but copies had already traveled farther than he could reach. The Reeves family received a formal apology and a settlement that did not pretend money could repair a shoulder or lost wages or years of blame. Martin Cole's daughter came forward. Alonzo Briggs's widow sent Annie a letter written in careful blue ink. I was told your father signed off on the job. I hated his name for 20 years. I am sorry. Annie read it twice, then placed it in the tin box, because the truth had to make room for other people's pain too. The old Ashland machine yard changed slower. Richard bought Bay 3, but the deed was placed under the fund. The wall with Samuel's words was not painted over. Build it clean. Rich remained there, sealed behind clear glass. The first time Annie saw it finished, she stood in the doorway with her father's coat over her arm and said nothing for a long while. The Carter Trade Center opened in the spring. There were folding chairs, coffee and paper cups, donuts from a bakery on Harford Road, and a ribbon no one wanted Richard to cut. Annie cut it with Evelyn's sewing scissors. Leonard complained they were dull. Evelyn told him to hush before she gave him something else to worry about. Young men and women from the city filled the first class. Some came because they wanted to learn engines. Some came because the program paid for bus passes. Some came because work with dignity had become rare enough to sound like a promise. At the entrance hung the old photograph of Samuel and Richard under the shop sign, but the plaque beneath it did not flatter either man. Carter and Whitmore Repair Company, founded with skill, ambition, loyalty, and a debt that took too long to tell the truth. Below that was a second photograph, Samuel alone at the workbench, sleeves rolled, head bent in concentration. Annie liked that one better. Richard attended the opening but did not speak until Annie asked him to. When he stepped to the small microphone, he looked at the wall before he looked at the crowd. "I spent years letting people call me self-made," he said. "I was not. I was helped, corrected, warned, forgiven, and saved by Samuel Carter. I mistook his mercy for permission. This place exists because his daughter refused to let my version be the last one." He stepped away without waiting for applause. That mattered to Annie more than the speech. After the ceremony, Evan found her near Bay 3. "My father wants to know if you'll come to dinner sometime." Annie gave him a look. Evan raised both hands. "I told him that sounded too easy." "It does. I also told him to ask again in a year." "That sounds better." He nodded toward the training floor. "You did this." "No," Annie said. "We did. Daddy started it. I just found the box." Evan looked at the glass over Samuel's words. "Sometimes I think about what my life would have been if he hadn't paid that debt." Annie looked at him. "Maybe that's the wrong question. What's the right one? What your life should become because he did." Evan took that in quietly. That evening, Annie went back to the rented house, no longer under notice. Richard had offered to buy it outright for her. She refused until Evelyn suggested a trust in Samuel's name that made the house a community repair fund office, with Annie allowed to live there while she worked and studied. Annie accepted that because it did not feel like rescue. It felt like use. The basement had been cleaned. The boxes were stacked properly now. On a small table sat the tin box, the diary, the debt note, the photograph, her father's letter, and the broken watch stopped at 2:17. Annie opened the diary to the last blank page and wrote slowly, "Daddy, I returned the paper, but I kept your name." She let the ink dry before closing it. Upstairs, Evelyn called from the kitchen. "You want coffee or tea?" Annie picked up the tin box and held it for a moment. "Tea," she called back. "Fresh, or the kind you stretch too far?" Annie smiled, and this time it did not hurt. "Fresh." At Whitmore Estate, Richard placed Samuel's photograph on his desk, not in the lower library, not behind a cabinet, not where guilt could pretend to be preservation. When visitors asked, he told them plainly, "This was Samuel Carter. He was my partner. I erased him. His daughter made me tell the truth. Some people grew uncomfortable. Richard let them. One evening, alone in the office, he looked at the photograph and said, 'I'm sorry, Sam. It was not enough. It would never be enough.' But for the first time, the apology was not locked away. And across Baltimore, in a small house with a clean basement and tea warm on the table, Annie Carter no longer felt as if she were packing up the remains of a forgotten man. She was living inside the name he had left her. A name, no gate, no lawyer, no mansion, and no polished lie could keep buried anymore. The lesson of Annie Carter's story is that truth may be buried, delayed, or denied, but it does not disappear. A person's worth is not measured by wealth, titles, or the size of the house they live in, but by the integrity they carry when no one is watching. Samuel Carter died without fame. Yet his kindness, sacrifice, and name outlived the lie built over him. The story reminds us that justice is not always quick, and it is not always fair, but when someone is brave enough to speak for the forgotten, even the most powerful walls can begin to crack. Most of all, it teaches that money can repay a bill, but only truth can restore a person's honor. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.